This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Thank you. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. This is All-Star Superboy, Chapter 5, the finale, and we're going out with another double feature. In the second half of this episode, I'll be welcoming first-time guest Adam Daltorio as we discuss the final Superboy stories before his erasure from continuity in the New 52. We'll also touch upon his 2019 return and where things currently stand for Connor Kent today. But first, joining me to discuss the Teen Titans run written by Geoff Johns is our pal and returning guest, Scott Honig. Welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a minute, but I am so glad to be back and talking about really one of my fairly early formative bits of DC is this Teen Titans series.
Right on. Scott, you and I have been podcasting together now for a good few years. And going back to the beginning, I remember reaching out to you to ask what runs, what stories you might be interested in for purposes of future discussions on this show and just podcasting generally. And I have to say, if there were a theme that emerged in your response, that theme would be Geoff Johns. So I know his work clearly means a lot to you. And this run in particular is one that we have talking about for years. And I'm sorry that we've had to wait this long. You were my guest. You've been on the show a number of times, but you were my guest on episode 2 of Digging for Kryptonite. And here we are just a few away from 200. And we're finally getting to this row. Eventually it all comes around.
Unbelievable. I can't believe almost 200. That's crazy. Every time I get to come back, it's wonderful, whether I'm rereading something that I haven't experienced in a while, or whether I'm, reading something brand new and, getting to talk about it like a brand new fanboy. It's always a pleasure. And I really appreciate it.
Right on. So this is the ongoing Teen Titans series that kicked off in 2003, originally written by Geoff Johns and drawn by Mike McKone. Now, Johns would stay on the book for a good few years. For purposes of this conversation, we're primarily focusing on those first couple of years that brought us into the Connor Kent era or iteration of the character. It's the run that gave him the Connor Kent civilian identity and the t-shirt and jeans look, and the massive retcon that 50% of his DNA came not from former Cadmus director Paul Westfield, but rather none other than Lex Luthor. And of course, this created this huge secret that he kept from most of the rest of the team, except for Robin, and this internal conflict about what really makes him a hero or not, what makes him who he is. This specter hanging over him drove a lot of his character and the stories. And of course, really culminated in a big way in the Insiders, a crossover with the Outsiders ongoing series, where Lex Luthor activated this programming within Superboy and controlled him and had him attack his team. So it was all of Superboy's worst fears realized. But again, this run established what I would argue is the second major iteration of the character. We had our first decade with the OG version with the leather jacket and sunglasses and the brash attitude and whatnot. And now we segue into the Connor Kent version. And this is the version that I would venture to say most fans, and especially if you're not a comic book fan, but you know the character from other media, this is almost certainly the one that comes to mind.
Absolutely. And I think one of the reasons why I tended to gravitate towards Geoff Johns as a writer in the early 2000s is because he, I think more than any other creative at DC at the time, had become known for sort of reinventing, not drastically reinventing, but reinventing a lot of their most popular franchises. I mean, his run on The Flash is incredibly well received. He revived Hawkman, the JSA, and when he stepped onto the Teen Titans, I just felt like this was a great jumping on point. I mean, he's got a great art team with him. Those Michael Turner covers were absolutely stunning. And I just felt like as a relatively young person, I was in my, early 20s. I had, a job and some disposable income, and I was able to branch out my comics reading. And it just seemed like a no-brainer to start with Teen Titans and see how it was. And I really fell in love with this series pretty quickly. And Connor's a huge reason why. I really loved this character because I really didn't know a whole lot about him, with the exception of his initial introduction during Reign of the Superman. So to see where he had come, how he'd progressed in 10 years was a real treat. So I have a real soft spot for this series.
Right on. I have to say, this run fell during what I would consider the golden age of Geoff Johns at DC. Yeah. What's funny is I've been talking about how much I loved Young Justice, and boy, I really loved Young Justice, and I was really upset when that book didn't make it and it got canceled. Yet, I think my fandom of Geoff Johns was powerful enough that I was able to overcome that disappointment and look forward to and ultimately enjoy this Teen Titans series. I mean, we're going back over 20 years, but as best as I can remember, I was there for this. I was on board. I definitely remember buying and reading this and enjoying it monthly as it was coming out. And so I think I was just such a fan of him. And of course, to have our core foursome from Young Justice, Robin, Impulse, soon to be rebranded, Kid Flash, Superboy, and Wonder Girl make their way over. Having that connective tissue, of course, was huge. But no, this run by Johns really introduced me to the concept of the Teen Titans. And what I really loved both then and now was this intergenerational aspect where you have that young quartet that we mentioned, but then you also have Cyborg and Beast Boy and Starfire and a little bit of the way into it, Raven acting as the mentors, right, to this young group. So they're, if we put it in TV revival terms, they're the legacy cast. Superboy in particular evolves quite a bit. I think there is a fair argument to be made, or at least a fair question to be asked about whether the Superboy we spend time with in this era lines up totally with the Superboy that had come before. Definitely a number of changes in terms of look, backstory, characterization, and whether or not it's just a natural evolution or a bit of a reboot of the character. I don't know. What I do know is I enjoyed these issues at the time, and man, did I have a blast revisiting them.
Good.
Oh yeah. I mean, it really held up great. And it just took me back to that time. And I hadn't gone back to these issues in particular in forever. So it was really a treat.
Yeah, no, I hadn't read them since I originally read them. I didn't have that background, but even rereading it now and sort of knowing a little bit more, I just found I didn't care, because I really liked this characterization of Connor, and I didn't really care how we got there. I just know I like these stories. I like the dynamic he has with the individual characters, with the characters, the team as a whole, and then with the larger DC universe. So whether or not we ultimately land on this being inconsistent, I just don't care.
Okay, fair enough. And I get that, especially not having spent the time with Connor in his solo series or in Young Justice. This really being, aside from Reign itself, this really being what introduced you to the character and formed your understanding of who this Superboy is. And even as someone who did have that background, I still can't deny the appeal and the effectiveness of these stories, in fairness. So this question, this idea that I've been kicking around a lot, even putting aside, is it a natural evolution or not? But even putting that aside, just which version of the character do I gravitate towards the most? What do I prefer? And I guess the ultimate boring answer is I like them both. But if I'm going to unpack it and hopefully offer something a little bit more meaningful here, over the course of these past episodes, going back and rereading that entire Superboy solo series from the 90s and early 2000s, firmly within our OG iteration of Superboy, aka CONNER, I did genuinely have fun with those issues, and I hope that came through in the discussions. At the same time, that I have an overwhelmingly glowing view of them? No, I think that's also true from the discussions. And so I guess I look at that first iteration of Superboy, and I think that if I'm being really honest with myself, and in fairness, I think Young Justice is an exception because what I have read of Young Justice really did hold up for me. Nevertheless, I think if I'm really being honest, I probably like the idea of OG Superboy more than I like the actual execution when we look at the stories, if I'm being completely honest. Whereas when we get into the Connor Kent era, and this is not to knock any of the previous creators who worked on the first version of Superboy, but these Geoff Johns stories, the specific arcs that you and I zeroed in on for this discussion, what we're going to talk about later this episode, the Boy of Steel arc in Adventure Comics, qualitatively, I think they're very strong. And I do think they are stronger in many ways than what came before. So I think in terms of execution, the Connor Kent era probably delivers in a more effective way. But as far as the idea of the Connor Kent version, and this is where I think I still feel a little bit of tension here, and this might not make much sense, but I'm speaking from the heart, so just bear with me on this. The idea of Superboy's DNA coming from Superman and Lex Luthor fits. Of course it fits. It's an almost obvious idea. Having him adopt the civilian identity of Connor Kent and go to Smallville High and live on the farm and take care of Crypto, also the most natural thing in the world. Calls to mind decades worth of pre-crisis Clark Superboy stories. There's a long history and tradition of this with this. There's nothing that is necessarily jarring or off-putting about it. It's a very, very natural fit. There is a part of me though that just kind of finds an appeal in the kind of offbeat formation of that original Superboy. Like, yeah, the explanation of how he was cloned and how Cadmus director Paul Westfield supplied the DNA and they manipulated him to look like Superman and they grafted Superman's aura onto him and that gave him this tactile telekinesis and he lives in Hawaii with this odd group of characters. It's weird. Like, it's weird and offbeat, but there is something appealing to me about that as opposed to something that fits so perfectly well and is so obvious. And I know this might not make a ton of sense. And to reiterate, like, I do love all of these Connor Kent stories, but when I really kind of go back to the idea of it, I still feel that little bit of tension.
No, it makes a ton of sense. And one of the hardest things I think that as fans of anything really, but particularly comic book fans is we have a very, very difficult time holding two competing opinions or thoughts in our head simultaneously, because we feel like you can either love this or you can love this, or you can love this or you hate it, and there's no middle ground. And the reality is, I think that there are almost in a way like two different Superboys that we're dealing with here. And if you want a Superboy who really is kind of off on his own, who occasionally maybe crosses over with something else or someone else from the larger DC universe, then that original 10 years of material will hit your sweet spot. If you want a Connor who is a little bit more embedded in the larger DC universe, who's a part of something larger than himself, where the stories aren't his stories, but they're sort of shared stories, and he certainly gets his time in the spotlight as we sort of move that thing around. Everybody does. Then I think these stories might hit your sweet spot a little bit more. So I think it just depends on like what time in your life did you discover these stories, right? Because we've always said the age at which you discover something has a lot to do with your continued enjoyment. I think it has to do with what you're looking for in a DC story at any given moment in your life. So yeah, I mean, look, I was just in a point in my life where I was, I think, ready for these kinds of stories. I was ready to learn about the Teen Titans. This was a really great primer. It had wonderful character interplay. I'll even add something to the list of things that you said really fits for this version of Connor. I think the budding romance between him and Cassie Sandsmark Wonder Girl also fits really, really well, and actually gives us something that I think a lot of Superman fans have been looking for, which is the what would feel like a logical Superman Wonder Woman relationship, but because of Lois Lane, and this is not a complaint, but because of Lois Lane, they really didn't tackle that until the New 52. I think we get a version of that here that feels very natural. The relationship develops over time, slowly. There are hurdles in their path, and the ways that they sort of grow closer to each other fit and feel real and natural, like young people developing feelings for each other.
I couldn't agree more. And it's funny, one thing I had totally forgotten about, and it's not on the app, but I happened to come across it and was able to find it the way we have to find these things when they're not otherwise available. The 2006 Teen Titans Annual, which is set, I believe it's in between the pages of Infinite Crisis number 5 or something like that. But if it's right in during Infinite Crisis, it's before Connor makes the ultimate sacrifice during Infinite Crisis and battle with Superboy Prime. But it's where Connor and Cassie consummate their relationship in the loft of the barn. And it's a beautiful moment where they are both recuperating from recent battles, and I believe Connor articulates like, this might be our last night. And she says, there's no one I'd rather spend it with. And they spend the night together. And it's the loft of the barn is straight out of Smallville. So I felt right at home. And it's a really beautiful, tender moment between the two of them, and a key point in their relationship that I had totally forgotten about. And had I not stumbled across it, I wouldn't have remembered. So I'm glad that I did. But no, that aspect of it was great. So we could spend a few more minutes on this later, but I guess the other thing that maybe sometimes feeds my frustration a little bit is just that when you look at other media adaptations, and specifically I'm referring to the Scion episode of Smallville from season 10, the Young Justice animated series, and the live action Titans series, they draw very specifically from the Geoff Johns, Connor Kent era of the Superboy character. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially given Geoff Johns' involvement, for example, with the Titans show, and just given the period of time that we're talking about here. But I guess on the comic book front, even if there's a debate about whether or not the two versions really line up with each other, at least you have that comic book background. You have that original version of the character. I do think that adaptations that completely excise that first version of the character, I feel like we're losing a little something. And I know, especially if you're talking about a single episode of Smallville, there's only so much time to explore this. I do get that. But I think that kind of feeds into it as well for me, where it's like, okay, if we're going to kind of show the growth of the character on screen, whether it's animated or live action, that's something else. But this part seems like it really just gets lost in the shuffle, and that does bum me out a little bit. And so anyway, but we could talk a little bit more about that. But I have to share this. So regardless of how any of us might feel about the retcon with respect to Lex Luthor supplying 50% of the DNA, there is one person who has never wavered on this. And I want to read something here. So in issue 26 of the solo Superboy series from 1996, there was a letter to the editor in the letters page. Dear Frank, Superboy number 20 had everything. Superboy, Green Lantern, Makoa, Black Manta, the Scavenger, Surprise, Action, Intrigue, the Goggles, and most important, Crypto. Then it goes on talking about the issue. Towards the end, the letter says, okay, now for some suggestions and stuff. First of all, I'd love to see a meeting between Superboy and Supergirl. It's been a while. Also, chalk up another vote for the Robin-Superboy crossover. Last thought. I think I know who Superboy is a clone of. How about Lex Luthor? Ooh. All the pieces fit, and it would have some great ramifications. And this letter, of course, from Clarkston, Michigan, is from a young Jeffrey Johns.
Wow. How'd you discover that?
Because this is digging for kryptonite, man. This is what we do here.
Wow, what a neat little piece of archival history there.
And the best part is the response from the editor. Superboy and Supergirl? Check. Robin Superboy? Check. Lex Luthor as DNA donor? I'm sorry. 2 out of 3 ain't bad, though. Well, time and his own pen would prove Geoff Johns right. that is astounding to me that here he is with this fan theory / suggestion. And years later, he's in a position to make it Bible. Like, this is the canon of the character. Even, I mentioned adaptations, even the Reign of the Superman animated movie, which at least gave us the classic Superboy look and brash attitude and characterization, still went right to Lex being one of Superboy's quote unquote parents. This is never changing. And I'm not saying it should, but it's just fascinating to me that he was able to will this into existence. We manifest things here on this podcast, but this is a whole other level.
Wow. Well, I mean, look, I think a lot of us do it. I mean, anybody who has that sort of writerly instinct, you read the comics and you start creating your headcanon, and, you think about where you want the stories to go, what characters you'd like to see, what kinds of adventures you want to see the characters go on. And, sometimes they happen. So most of the time they don't, the way that you prescribed them. But the few who graduated from fan to creator, now you get to play with all the toys in an official way. And why would you not do the thing that you've always wanted to do, particularly if you pitch it to the editors and the editors approve it? Like, yeah, go for it.
Funny enough, so I was looking through the back matter of the Infinite Crisis collection, and Geoff Johns shares a lot about the making of that. And a lot of it, of course, has to do with Superboy dying in Infinite Crisis. And We've talked about this before, but just to reiterate, that was not the original intention, right? Dan DiDio wanted to kill off Nightwing in Infinite Crisis. And as John says in that back matter of Infinite Crisis, he literally says, I offered up Superboy as the sacrificial lamb. That was the trade-off to keep Dick alive, was Superboy would die instead. I knew that part, but what I had forgotten about was elsewhere in that interview, Johns talks about how he fought to include Superboy in Teen Titans. Huh. I don't know. I haven't come across other interviews that delve into that further, but it did come up there that he fought for Superboy in Teen Titans. And I mean, I get it in the sense that historically, no, Superboy is not a Teen Titans character, but obviously coming off of Young Justice and given the era of DC that we're in, I mean, it feels like such a no-brainer. It's like, why? Who would fight you on that? But apparently they did. But I'm glad he stuck to his guns, and I'm glad that, for many reasons, I'm glad that Superboy was part of this team. But yeah, at the end of the very first issue of Teen Titans, Superboy finds Robin in the study on his computer, and Robin gets an email from someone named Snapdragon, who eventually will learn is Lex Luthor himself. But this email reveals Superboy's true genetic code, that 50% comes from Lex Luthor. This retcon, and this is a retcon, this was not originally intended, is that no, Lex had figured out that he could essentially stabilize the Kryptonian DNA with human DNA and made it his own rather than Paul Westfield's. And that's how we end up with a much simpler, cleaner explanation that he is a hybrid clone, 50% Superman, 50% Lex. And that's what we've had ever since.
So I'm wondering, because I'm sort of applying the Marvel no prize process to this, right? Where if you can come up with your own logical explanation, you win essentially nothing. I wonder if, because it's Lex Luthor, somebody who, has the money and the power and the influence and the resources to operate completely in the shadows and only inform who he wants to inform about what he's actually doing. Is it reasonable to think that Paul Westfield and the people of Cadmus really did believe at the time that the human DNA that went into this clone was Westfield's, but it was all being manipulated by Luthor behind the scenes in ways that nobody knew about, and it only now comes out? Does that jive with your understanding of those stories?
So yes and no. I think with respect to Westfield, I think you're right. I mean, my reading of this, I do think Westfield believed that he was the donor, right? And so I'm forgetting exactly which issue this pops up in. It might be the aftermath issue of The Insiders, where Raven takes Superboy on a little bit of a vision quest and discovers that he actually does have a soul. It's a new and growing, but he has a soul. But he sort of visits key moments. I think there's flashbacks there. And then I know there are flashbacks in that Teen Titans annual. They don't line up. In one of the flashbacks, Lex is bald in the past. And then the other flashback, he has the flowing mane of red hair, which was accurate to the comics at the time. But
Right.
but in any event, in those flashbacks, he's working with his own team, right, to devise this. So yeah, I mean, I think in terms of him keeping things from Westfield, for example, that part tracks. Here's the thing that doesn't track. So first of all, honestly, I think the biggest thing is just that in rereading Reign of the Supermen, as I have, to me, it's pretty clear that Lex is genuinely surprised at the existence of Superboy. And there's even one of the issues where he calls in, I guess, Happerson, I want to say, from Cadmus, who's supposed to be his mole there. And he's really grilling him essentially about, like, what the hell? Like, you were supposed to tell me about this. So I think it's pretty clear. Also, as we've talked about so many times, I mean, that version of Lex in the early 90s, this was when he had faked his death and was posing as his own son in a cloned body. So at this point in time, he's a clone.
Right.
And allegedly now also providing the DNA, half the DNA for this new clone.
Right.
And then the last thing is, in one of these flashbacks in these Teen Titans stories, and again, a lot of this really is kind of blurring together, but bear with me on this. But in at least one of those flashbacks, yeah, you know what? In one of them, he's talking with scientists, but I swear in one of the other ones, it's just him in the lab. The post-crisis Lex was not the man of science.
Right.
He was not the mad scientist. We would come back to that around this time, and certainly Birthright would reestablish that. But back in the day, post-crisis, no, he was the businessman, and he always had his team around him. So yeah, I mean, I think there are a few things that don't line up, but that is a retcon, right? And it's never going to be a perfect fit. Sometimes things kind of slide in more effectively than others. Like, this is not the hill I'm going to die on. Like, to be clear, it's not. I get it, and I think they made it work as well as they could.
I found myself, because of that revelation, like you said, it comes towards the end of that first issue, so it's pretty early on, so it gives us lots of things to really look at. Every time Connor is on panel, every time he's speaking with anybody, particularly Robin, because Robin is the person he knows, and they keep that secret. Even during some times where there was an opportunity to reveal it to his teammates, and he chooses not to, and it causes some tension. So I think that having that in place as I'm reading made some of the dialogue and even some of the narration hit so much harder. Like, these are really well written issues. Like, I mean, if you'll forgive me for a moment, like, I'm just sort of skimming through my notes and seeing some of this dialogue that I picked out. I mean, there's a moment in issue 1 where I think Superman is dropping Connor off for the first time at the Kent farm. He has been enrolled in Smallville High. He's going to start going. He's basically going to have a traditional teenage experience, which is not what he wants to do. Like, as far as he's concerned, like, he's been a high-flying superhero for the last bunch of years. This feels like a demotion in some ways. He's really bitter about it. And he says, I'm above all this, way above it. And Superman warns him, watch the ego. Like, you're still part human. And to me, like, that ego, that's Lex. Lex feels like he's above everyone. And so it feels natural that Connor doesn't have Superman's humility, A, because he has the Luthor DNA, and B, because he wasn't raised by the Kents. So he never learned humility the way that Clark did. He reveals to Cassie at one point that he's tired. He's so tired of worrying about what I should do instead of worrying about what I want to do. And he feels like he should have more autonomy, but there are these adults, Clark and the Kents and others, who keep trying to tell him what to do or what not to do, as though he's a child, and he is growing up against that tide. He tells Robin, it's like I got a 50-50 chance of growing up to be the world's greatest hero or the world's greatest villain. And that, to me, really summed up that whole plot point of the DNA. And for that reason alone, I think that the retcon is worth it, because that motivation right there of constantly having to second guess where his motivations are coming from. Am I trying to be Superman here, or is the Lex Luthor in me taking over, and will I not recognize it until it's too late? Like, am I going down the dark path here in ways that I really don't want to? And I think those are legitimate fears and legitimate concerns. And then they bear themselves out in this series. So it's not even just this unfounded fear that he has to fight against and overcomes it. I mean, he really does some damage later on. So I think for me, there's just something really nice about it. You know, there's some internal narration that he has where, I mean, the Lex really starts coming in. I mean, when he is reprimanded by his principal, he's thinking to himself, I hate keeping my feet on the ground. Right? He's rejecting that human side of him. And then he says this, which really took me by surprise. These inbred hicks are lucky I'm following these lame rules. I could level this whole place in a matter of minutes if I wanted to. I could break all their necks. And then he pauses. He says, I didn't mean that. Why did I think that? So he even has these intrusive thoughts that are straight out of the Luthor playbook and not out of the Kent or L family playbooks. There's something about that again makes me not care that this doesn't line up with the previous iteration, because I just think there's so much meaty characterization there, and I just love it.
Yeah, no. To be clear, like, I'm not arguing against the retcon. Like I understand why they did it, and it makes sense. And no, it is genuinely compelling for all those reasons that you cited. And look, any parent, right, or any child, you wonder / worry what you might get from your parents, what you might carry on. And it's one thing if you come from Superman, but if you also have half of your DNA coming from the world's greatest villain, clearly his genetics, he literally says in these issues that his genetics are who he is. And this ties back with a moment that I've quoted in multiple episodes now, but back in the Kiesel Grummet run when he's fighting Match and he's talking about how, like, I don't have parents, I don't have memories, like being Superboy, this is it. This is what I have. This is who I am. And so you see the weight, the importance that he's put on this. He gets to the point where, as I was alluding to before, he asks Raven, do I have a soul? I mean, we really get into some heavy questions about what it means to be a person, to be alive. And so to have his whole sense of self undermined by this revelation, it would rock anyone. And so, like you said, the secret that he keeps from the team for most of these first couple of years of the Teen Titans book is always hanging over everything. At the end of that first issue and into the second issue, he's real quick to dismiss this as a prank, a hoax, misinformation, whatever you want to call it. And I think it's at the conclusion of those first few issues where Robin performs a DNA test and confirms that what he learned is in fact true. And a great moment between them, because initially Superboy is put off. He's like, you're just like Batman. But they talk it out, and Robin's like, no, like, I'm here for you. There's going to come a time where I'm going to need you too. I know you'll be there for me. And I love this moment where Superboy is like, I was wrong. You're nothing like Batman. And Tim goes, I'm nothing like anyone, which was great. There are so many great moments for all the characters, but especially Tim. And I know this is not a Robin podcast, but maybe my favorite thing is early on when Starfire grounds our younger heroes. This is after Bart has been shot by Deathstroke, who we'll later learn is Jericho actually possessing the body of his father, Slade Wilson. But this is this great moment where essentially they're ordered to stay at the tower, and Robin seemingly goes along with this. He tells Starfire, sure, no problem. I'll see what I can dig up on my computer. And Wonder Girl and Superboy follow Robin. Like, what are you, like, you're just going to sit here? And he starts cutting out a hole in the window, and Wonder Girl's like, you lied to Starfire? And he turns around, and this was such a badass moment. Tim goes, I lied to Batman. It's like, it was great. It was like, those moments are great. And so I love the furthering of that dynamic between them. And yes, it hangs over everything. And there is a moment, I believe these were in issues that we did not specifically single out, but I did a little skim through. But this is around the time when Mia, Speedy, joins the team. Yeah. And she confesses that she's HIV positive, which was a big plot line in the Judd Winnick Green Arrow book of the time. And this really opens the door, and you have various team members share the things that they've been keeping. Wonder Girl talks about how Ares has been visiting her, how he gifted her this lasso that can electrocute whoever it's around. And it kind of goes on and on. Superboy is silent, though. He does not participate in this. And this is right before Luthor activates him. And right before Luthor activates him, he's about ready. He's worked up the nerve to go tell them, and then it proves to be too late, and then all of this spills out. But yeah, I mean, that obviously provides, a key source. And he keeps this from from everyone. And there is a great moment where in that internal narration, Connor thinks about how the Kents would react. And I really like this because he was like, I know they'll say it's okay, and that it's not it's not about what your genetics are. It's about what you do. It's about action. But I loved it. Just kind of rang true because it would have been disingenuous. Like it would have felt off note if he was worried about how they would react or that they would cast him out. Of course, that's not the Kent. So I loved it. Showed how well he knows them, but it still didn't alleviate the concerns that he had. Right. So I just felt like that was very, very true to all of their characters.
But there is that scene that you mentioned where Beast Boy reveals right away that he's really scared of becoming this future version of himself because he's really unhappy about that development. Raven is feeding off of other people's emotions. She sort of reveals that her concern about that, Cassie's fear about seeing Ares everywhere. And then the camera actually shifts to this look between Robin and Connor as if to say, like, your turn. You've got something to and Connor looks away. He won't do it. So I like the fact that it's not just that his reveal is absent. It's that it's conspicuously absent. It's, they make the big deal. Johns makes a big deal to highlight it for the readers who are in a position of knowing, whereas the other characters don't. I just thought it was such a great sequence of issues with all of these insights into Connor's character that ultimately culminate in this opportunity that's squandered.
Yeah, even when you have a moment like that where, man, it's a perfect opportunity for him to speak up and share this and alleviate his burden, you also get why he wouldn't do that. We mentioned Superman a few times here. He, of course, at the end of the Superboy series, which we talked about previously, brings Superboy to the farm, finally. And then we see him checking in with Connor here, and intervenes when Connor ditches school and delivers the invitation to join the Teen Titans. The whole setup for this series is it's a weekend activity. Clark's idea, apparently, like the Boy Scouts, right? You fly out after school on Saturday, you come back Sunday, or on Friday, and then you come back Sunday night. So it's this weekend activity for them to be together, to learn, to train, and whatnot. Overall, I'm just pleased that Clark has finally taken more of an interest in this kid. And this is something when we look at, with the exception of Smallville, but when we look at these other adaptations, the Young Justice cartoon and the Titan series, he's absentee at best. Young Justice, the animated show, is it takes him a real long time to warm up. I mean, he is particularly cold. But yeah, I like that he's actually showing an interest in Connor in these stories. And I do like when he brings Crypto. Now, we haven't gotten into this too specifically, but we have mentioned Crypto in previous episodes in the Superboy solo series. Now, that was a regular human canine, Earth canine, right? In those stories, that was the puppy that Bibbo Babowski saved from drowning, right, during the funeral for a friend era, and then eventually comes to stay with Superboy. That Crypto's last appearance is at Cadmus during the second Kiesel Grummet run, and then, to my knowledge, just disappears. And then the Crypto that we have for the next phase is the Crypto that came from the Silver Agey Krypton from the Loeb Kelly run on the Superman books that was ultimately revealed to be this Phantom Zone construct. But that's where we got that Crypto. So this is a super powered Crypto who Superboy takes care of and lives on the farm. But yeah, I love that moment.
No, it's wonderful.
Visually, we shift to the t-shirt and jeans look. Super easy for cosplay. I had that black shirt with the red S. We talked a lot about the Grant Morrison Action Comics run where we were from the New 52, where we're dealing with the young Superman in the beginning with the t-shirt and jeans. There is something very, very visceral and tactile about that kind of look. So yeah, I don't have super strong feelings. I mean, it's definitely, when you think of this era, you think of this run, you think of Connor Kent. I mean, it really does come to mind. But beyond that, of course, the powers, right? So we spent a lot of time talking about tactile telekinesis and how they mentioned it like damn near every issue. And did I miss it? I don't know so much. I mean, he still technically has the power. He uses it occasionally, but really now his Kryptonian powers start to emerge as he gets older. And so in that first arc, when Jericho possesses him, Superboy, he's able to access the heat vision. And then later on, when the Justice League and Titans come into conflict, essentially what precipitates that is Wonder Woman had not signed off on Cassie joining the team, and she shows up and tensions flare. And then we have a little bit of a skirmish. But what I love about this hits on 2 points, the powers, but also the relationship with Superman. There's this great moment in that issue where Connor and Clark are talking, and Connor's heat vision inadvertently goes off and blasts Superman in the back. And he turns and he looks, and then we cut to a different scene. And you would expect, right? What would be the kind of the obvious choice here? You would expect them to tussle or something like that, but they don't, right? The next time you see them, they're flying together, and Clark's like, Mom made me this cape. And Connor's like, oh, do you have to tell her? Which I loved, because in virtually every instance, you had the mentor and the sidekick. They're not at each other's throats out for blood, but they are going at it. And I just loved the two of them, and it felt perfectly in keeping from Clark's perspective in particular. It's like, of course he would look for understanding and try to diffuse the situation. But just for the two of them, I really love that. And then his hearing kicks in. Yep. We see that in numerous instances. His X-ray vision develops while he's on his first date with Cassie at the restaurant. So you really see that more traditional power set. He does still have the tactile TK, but it doesn't really get used as much, and it definitely doesn't get name checked as in this era.
probably for the best. Probably for the best. No, I mean, I think both the costume and the powers sort of emerging one at a time speaks to the idea that Connor is growing up. He is still a sort of young hero in training, right? So he doesn't get the full uniform. And the powers coming in sort of like, Smallville, where, you had, the power that manifests is symbolically, metaphorically related to whatever conflict he's dealing with at the time, right? So it becomes this metaphor for whether you want to call it puberty or just sort of some other maturation process. I think it's a really smart device to use, because then you don't have to say directly what the character's going through, but it becomes sort of clear as an analog that this is what he's going through. And the costume, I think, is an important choice, if for no other reason than it becomes a stark contrast in the Titans Tomorrow arc, where a future version of the Titans come back to the present, or the Titans go to the future.
Our team goes to the future on their way back from the far future with the Legion of Superheroes.
With the Legion, right. And Connor is in a Superman costume. He's got the black background of the S, sort of like the our world's at war Superman symbol. But for us to see Connor looking like that, I think it should first sort of impress us, I think, like, oh, he's going to grow up and he's going to become Superman. But then we see kind of the darkness that's in that version of the Titans, and it becomes a little bit scary. And so if we didn't have Connor in a more subdued version of the costume, I think it wouldn't contrast as well with that version of Superman that we see.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. Now, also, we've been talking about this Connor Kent civilian identity. Now, fun fact, unless I'm mistaken, but I think I'm on the mark with this, because I was saying to myself, we know it's in Superboy number 59, which we discussed in a previous episode, that Superman gives him the Kryptonian name Con-El. And they call him Con for a while. And I'm saying to myself, but when does he switch to Connor? When does that start to be the thing? And look, to go from Con with a K to Connor with a C, it's like, okay, no, you see how that becomes the human version of the name, but like, at what point does this actually happen? And for all intents and purposes, it seems like Teen Titans #1. That's when we really start leaning into that. So Teen Titans #1 came out in July 2003. In June 2003, so just a month earlier, there was an issue of Batgirl number 41. There was actually one of the stronger issues of the Joe Kelly run on the Superboy title was a Batgirl Superboy team up. Great contrast there between the silent assassin and the motor mouth Superboy.
Because it's Cassandra Cain, right?
Exactly.
Batgirl?
Yes.
Yeah.
We're in that era. So in Batgirl number 41, a ways later, she pays Superboy a visit on the farm. So this is the point in time after his series has ended. It's right before the Teen Titans series starts. He's living on the farm. And we have Martha knocking on the door of his bedroom saying, Connor. So a little bit of trivia. I do believe that issue of Batgirl, which came out right before Teen Titans, I think that's the first instance where he's actually addressed as Connor. Now, of course, Teen Titans was about to release. I'm sure internally, right? I'm not saying Batgirl created this, but I'm sure it was known, like, oh, this is what he's going to be known as. But I think that was the first instance of that. So
I'm sure it was editorial coordination, some kind of, he's called Connor now. Yeah. Let's throw that in there. And, something like that. That makes sense.
Yeah,
that
exactly. In rereading those first issues of Titans, the Titans Together storyline, where the team forms and still dealing with all of the fallout from the death of Donna Troy in the Titans Young Justice Graduation Day miniseries. Cassie, in particular, very unsure of whether this is the right path for her. And then we have this attack, at first seemingly from Deathstroke, and then, of course, it turns out that it's Deathstroke's son, Jericho, who's possessing him. And reading Geoff Johns comics over the years, you do see there are certain arrows in his quiver that he will go back to. And one of them is the villain who is trying to make their hero better. And that's what Jericho claims here. That's the reason why he's attacking these young heroes, because he feels young heroes should not be out on the battlefield. And I'm going to show you the cost of this so that you won't do this anymore. And to me, it was very reminiscent of the Hunter Zolomon version of Zoom from the Flash title, where it's all about, I'm going to put you through pain to make you a better hero. So it just kind of called that to mind for me. And there's a two-parter. It's Teen Titans 16 and then a Teen Titans Legion one-shot special where it's Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes, where Connor's on his first date with Cassie and he disappears. And then he reappears shortly later with a Legion ring and a Superman costume. And it turns out he's been in the future for 5 months working with the Legion of Superheroes, going up against the Fatal Five, or really the Fatal 500, because the Persuader has been using his axe to cut through different realities and recruit hundreds of doppelgangers from different realities. And of course, years later, when Geoff Johns would write the Legion episode of Smallville, which villain does he use at the beginning of the episode? Persuader. So clearly a favorite. How did you feel about seeing this association between Connor Kent, Superboy, and the Legion? Obviously, this harkens back to the long pre-crisis tradition of Superboy and the Legion. Yet, at the same time, this Superboy is already part of a team. Just curious how you felt about this.
It's hard to say that I felt much about it, only because I have very little experience with the Legion. I've tried on a bunch of different occasions to get into the Legion when a new series begins, a new creator comes on. I just found that the concept of it, I think, just isn't for me. Not to say there hasn't been great work done on Legion comics. I just don't think it's for me. Where I really started to feel something was when his Titans teammates have doubts about which team he actually has an allegiance to. And they come right out and ask him basically, like, who are you going to pick? And I love his answer, because he says, I don't abandon my friends no matter what team they're on. And that's the right answer, right? So unfortunately, they presented him a binary and he's like, no, I'm going to settle right in the middle. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was a great moment, because essentially, the short version of this is that they're essentially trapped outside the space-time continuum, and he can only save, with what energy is left in the Persuader's axe, he can only save one. And so his plan is to take everyone back to the present and then figure out how to get the Legion home. But things go awry, and he ends up getting the Titans back almost to their present. They end up 10 years ahead in the future, and that's what brings them into contact with their future selves, the Titans of tomorrow. But the Legion ends up trapped, and this is actually the swan song for the 0 Hour reboot version of the team. And then they'll come back when we get into the Final Crisis Legion of Three Worlds business, which we've covered in the past. But this was, I do believe, the last time that we see this version for the time being. And in fact, that Titans Legion special that concludes this little two-parter, it ends with a story by Mark Waid and Barry Kitson that teed up their version, the three boot, I believe is that right? The three boot, is that what we're calling it? If memory serves?
So.
Yeah. So there's that aspect of it. So, it was cool. It was cool to see that. And I agree with you. I think that tension of not knowing where his loyalties might lie, given this intense months-long period he spent with them, I think there was, that was effective. And the other thing too is, and I was never aware of the connection point between these two stories, but there's an arc called Foundations from the Dan Abnett, Andy Lanning Legion series of this time. And so essentially, for anyone who's really looking to make a meal out of this, when Superboy is plucked from his date with Cassie and ends up in the future, he has even more adventures with them than what we're told about in this two-parter. So yeah, there is actually a relationship between those two stories, which is pretty cool. We mentioned these Titans of Tomorrow, where our team is confronted with these very extreme future versions of themselves. Connor sees this as an opportunity to talk to his future self about everything that he's going through with this revelation about his genetic makeup, and stumbles upon the team and Superman, his future self in particular, heat visioning off Deathstroke's arm. So it's a very extreme, severe version. And the ultimate takeaway is that it seems that team got to that point because they broke up, right? They didn't stay together. And so our team sort of has that as their takeaway here. I want to make sure we spend the time that we should on the insiders, because that's where really all of this comes to a head. This is when all of Superboy's worst fears, I mean, beyond his worst fears, right? Because what is he worried about? Well, he's worried about, he has this evil influence inside him. He's had these dark thoughts occasionally. Might he go down a different path? But this takes it to a whole other level, because it turns out Lex had implanted this programming, and this just flips a switch, Manchurian Candidate style, and he shaves his head bald, and he cuts an L into his shirt, and he attacks the team and doesn't even speak. He's just on the attack. And at the same time as this, and of course this is a crossover between Teen Titans and Outsiders, that android Indigo, it turns out she's actually Brainiac 8 and has had this hidden program within her, and so she attacks the team. So because Luthor and Brainiac are working in tandem, so they have Connor and Indigo / Brainiac 8 attack each of their teams. So all of this really comes to a head. It's that crossover, and especially the Teen Titans issues, very action-packed. It's brutal. Connor breaks Tim's arm. He strikes Cassie. I mean, it's really intense. I guess, well, how did you feel about this? How did you feel about the way that the payoff that we got here, that it's like, no, he's controlled and he's attacking them? How did this work for you?
I was on board. I thought it was a really organic progression from where the series started, all the seeds that had been laid, all the intrigue, the secret keeping, the fears about who he's going to become, trying to avoid that, but kind of playing right into it at the same time. It makes a ton of sense. And whether I mean, the fact that Connor's not in control of it, still allows for the character to be heroic, and but I thought this was great. I thought the way that it connected to the Outsiders book, which really is its own sort of Teen Titans-ish book. Those are the characters who mostly graduated from the Teen Titans and become something else, not fully a Justice League, but something in between. And again, I thought that the fact that it was Connor and Indigo was a really nice pickup from all the way back in Graduation Day, when they were sort of clashing when Indigo first arrived. So I thought it was great. It was super entertaining, really great character moments. I loved it.
So I think visually, and there's one of those Mike McKone covers of Superboy with the bald head and the L cut into his shirt is so striking. And it's, I think, a perfect visual representation of this inner conflict made external. So I think visually it's really strong. It's funny. I was always on board with the storyline, and it's not that I'm not now, but as I'm rereading it, I'm saying to myself, it just would have been a different story. But part of me wonders, would it not have been more interesting if Lex activates his code, but the code isn't kill, but rather use your wits and kind of take apart the team on a more intellectual, emotional level. Like, it would have been interesting to see Superboy slowly start to act differently, or even maybe not so slowly act differently, but actually speak and kind of go about things that way, as opposed to just physically attacking. I mean, I guess that's part of the point, that it is such a flip and it takes everybody by surprise. And now when this revelation finally comes out, and to your point about these reactions from everyone about like, oh my God, how could he not tell us? And to Robin, like, how could you keep this from all of us? It works. I mean, I think it has an impact, but yeah, like I said, it just part of me thinks it would have been interesting. Maybe this is the Smallville fan who watched all of those episodes on about Clark on different versions of Kryptonite acting weird. It's like, I don't know. It would have been interesting to see that.
So I would agree with you if this had been Deathstroke or Dr. Light or a traditional sort of Teen Titans villain, or even a new Teen Titans villain who's trying to take apart the team from the inside. If the Titans were the true enemy, I think that would have made a lot more sense. Because this is Luthor, who's not a Titans villain, he's a Superman villain. And he has this moment where he sort of lays out why he did all this, and it ultimately comes down to Superman. I mean, he's never been able to physically get the better of Superman. So he's thinking about, okay, what is going to destroy Superman, right? He says, like, you have to reach deeper. You have to find something that he loves or create something he will love. So if you create this sort of son/nephew/brother, this sort of super family member, that he loves this boy. It took time, but he got there. He loves this boy. And when this boy turns against the Justice League's children, when Superman buries those coffins, that will kill him. And so with that motivation laid out, for me, I think it fits Lex's motivation for always, right? It keeps Superman sort of in Connor's sphere and loop. And it, I think, helps to explain why the plan was this particular thing at that particular moment.
Fair. No, I think that's fair. I think you're right. I mean, yeah, we're Lex to opt to go the other way. I don't know what purpose it would have served for him other than a better story for us, or a different story for us. But no, I think your point is well taken. Your point is well taken. And during the battle, Cassie does use her lasso, the Ares lasso, and that electricity, kind of shocks him out of it a little bit. But then he's still under the programming, and then it's ultimately really when Lex is going after Cassie that he snaps out of it. And this is a real low point for Connor. These issues coming out of the Insiders, the next few issues of Titans, when we actually see him, he's placed himself under house arrest. I mentioned that visit from Raven where she visits with him on the farm and shows him that he does in fact have a soul, which is a very nice moment. But those next few issues, those aftermath issues, and then the first few issues of Infinite Crisis, really, his whole thing is he feels like he's a liability. He betrayed everyone. He's just on the farm. He's not taking that action. All of the events leading up to and the events of Infinite Crisis are unfolding. You have Martha on numerous occasions in these stories being like, you should go help your friends. And he's not getting there. In Infinite Crisis #1, which we did not specifically reread for this, and we've covered on the show before if people want full discussions of this. But at one point he gets up and he's about to he rips the shirt, but then he sits back down. And so as we move forward and we ultimately get to the moment of his sacrifice in Infinite Crisis, it all comes to a head when Superboy Prime shows up at the farm and challenges Connor, and they have this battle. And I do like in that initial battle and then in the rematch at Alexander Luthor's tower, his multiversal tower, I really do like this contrast between Superboy Prime, the quote unquote classic version of Superboy, who believes he's everything that Superboy should be and should stand for, versus Connor, who, on paper, given how he came to be, and as Superboy Prime points out, he doesn't even have a cape and, and all of this, right? It doesn't line up. And this has been, I think, a part of all of our conversations, doesn't line up with that quote unquote traditional pre-crisis classic version of the character, but he has the true heart of a hero and he steps up when it counts. And so, again, I know we're going beyond what we explicitly read, but I think going from this really low point in the Insiders when his worst fear is made real and he attacks and betrays his team and he's hiding out and he's not stepping forward, to actually getting to that point where he's back in it, he's challenging Superboy Prime and tackles him, and they crash into that tower and they destroy it, but it costs Connor his life. I guess one of my final questions as we're kind of winding down here a little bit is that death? I mean, I guess generally, how do you feel about it and the purpose that it serves in Connor's larger journey?
No, it hit me hard when I originally read it at the time it was coming out. And it hit me hard again today because now, I mean, of course, the whole purpose of this was to immerse ourselves in Connor. So as I'm reading these Teen Titans issues, I'm focused on Connor. So yeah, his death not only felt fitting, it felt like this is what we were building to, even though, as you've pointed out, I know that was not their original plan. It still felt very, very organic. All the Crisis events in some way or another, but Infinite Crisis in particular, is to me a meta commentary on the state of DC Comics at that particular time. And so even some of the things we've already talked about on this particular episode, it's like the Superboy Prime is commenting on how much these characters seem to have grown up, that they're really sort of in adult territory now. These comics are not really for kids, young kids, because they're dark and they're violent and they're complicated. So here is this very simplistic, or what had been a simplistic version of a Superboy saying, no, it's supposed to be simple. These are supposed to be light, fun adventures that kids can enjoy. And this version of Superboy isn't that. And so the fight seems to be representative of that battle, of those Silver Age sensibilities versus this 21st century sensibility where comics have really grown up. So it made sense that version of Superboy would kill this version of Superboy to try to restore an older paradigm of comics storytelling.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think everything that Johns laid out from the beginning of that Teen Titans run through the climactic battle with Superboy Prime, I think you really do see an arc there. And to see him wrestle with the revelation of issue 1 and then ultimately be controlled by Lex, to finally stepping up and having this confrontation, I think you really see a through line there. Now, it's really hard because we know that it wasn't the original intention for Superboy to die. So it's really hard for me to shake that and say, yes, like his death, that was the natural conclusion of this arc. I don't know that that's the case. I mean, it would have been interesting to see, had Superboy lived coming out of Infinite Crisis, what that would have looked like. Now, I guess at the same time, if somebody had to die in Infinite Crisis, and look, in these events, usually someone does bite it and we need to show the stakes of this and the consequences, Nightwing really would have felt more like that came out of nowhere, to me at least, versus Superboy, because of all of this that was going on. So even though it wasn't the original intention, I think as the culmination of everything that came before, there is something there. And then, he's off the board for a few years until he returns in Final Crisis, Legion of Three Worlds, which is a great return. But even then, it sort of feels like he was just kind of unpaused. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that sort of then begs a bit of a question of in terms of what role did it play in his larger journey? I don't know, other than when we get to what we're going to talk about in the next part of the episode. He in fairness, he does come back with I think a renewed sense of appreciation, right? And especially that life on the farm that he was so antagonistic towards before, now shows some appreciation for it. So, I guess there's something there.
Like you said, his return feels like an unpause. I mean, he even says, I don't know why I'm here, but I remember dying in Cassie's arms. Like, it's almost like his memory goes back to the moment he died and there's nothing in between. And now here he is. And his last statement on it is like, yeah, isn't it cool?
Yeah, which of course echoes what he said when he was dying in Cassie's arms, and she's like, "You saved everyone." He's like, "Isn't it cool?" Which was a nice sort of callback to the Connor that we first met, and a couple of things on that note, and just kind of the overall shift in characterization. So, I think it's very fair to say we definitely get a more sullen, less brash version of the character. I think probably angrier. Certainly at times. It's funny because I shared this with you off mic ahead of time, but one of our audience members, shout out to Rob Matthews, he made a comment on social media when we first started this run of episodes, and I've had this in my head and I wanted to share this. Rob said, you made a point about Connor's personality change when Geoff Johns took over. I actually thought this was kind of spot on. I'm a teacher, and a lot of guys who are loudmouths or mess around at 15, 16 really wise up and mature by 17, 18. I thought with Connor this fit and showed character growth, but I can see why it would come across another way for sure. At the time reading this, I knew that the DNA thing was a retcon, and I knew he was in a different costume. I don't know that I paid that much mind to the characterization shift, to be perfectly honest, when I was 16 reading this for the first time. Now I do see it. But to Rob's point, I think there might be something to that. And you are an educator as well yourself. And so let me toss it to you. I mean, does that comment ring true?
It rings very true, both as an educator and as a father of a teenage boy. Actually, I have three boys, but one of whom is approaching 17. The other is 13 and a half. So what I've seen over many, many years is usually between about 9th and 10th grade. The kids kind of go from being these sort of immature babies to being, real young adults. It's usually that summer between 9th and 10th grade. For a couple of them, it takes a little bit longer. Some of the boys, maybe between 10th and 11th, but there's usually that brief period where they just like figure things out for themselves. They also mellow out, that sort of young boy ADHD energy often kind of mellows. Like my 17-year-old was definitely like a kid with a lot of energy. And now more often than not, you will find him napping on my living room couch. He's a mellower kind of kid, but he's also much more introspective. He's not bored by things that are a little bit more sedentary. So I definitely see what Rob is talking about there. And I think that that's applicable to Connor. I think that he's more sullen, he's more thoughtful, more introspective, but he's also more powerful, right? He comes into his body more as well as into his mind. And by the time this whole era ends with his return at the end of Legion, he feels like a more fully formed person. He feels like, okay, this is the Connor he's going to be moving forward. Doesn't mean he doesn't still have more to learn. Doesn't still mean he still won't, make mistakes and grow and learn from them. But it does definitely feel like we're seeing the person he's going to become for the rest of his life.
Yeah, I think all of that is true. And I think too, I know I've used the example of the Ron Mars, Kyle Rayner run a bunch of times in this run of episodes, but I look at something like that, or the Jack Knight Starman run by James Robinson. And I think in an ideal scenario for me as a reader, it's great if you can have kind of a single creator for a truly extended period of time, shepherding the character and planning for and implementing that character growth. But in the nature of ongoing superhero comics, you don't always get that. And so sometimes what you end up with, I think sometimes maybe a little bit more falls on the reader to sort of say like, well, okay, I've seen 100 issues of the solo Superboy title. I've seen him go from the hero of Hawaii to the agent of Cadmus to the building super of Calvin Gardens. And I've also read 55 issues of Young Justice, and I've seen all of the adventures that he's had there. And then I've seen his world rocked by this revelation at the end of Titans #1, and I've seen him be used by Lex. So you have all of these things, and I'm not saying Geoff Johns didn't do any of this work himself as the writer. He did, but I still think as audience members, and I'm reminding myself of this as well, you got to take a step back, and it's like, this kid has been through a lot. He's been through a lot. And so for him to grow and change, you would want to see that. And so I think you see that, and maybe it's not spelled out as explicitly, but I think we can still account for it. What's funny, and I mentioned that Foundations arc from the Legion title, that the other thing I meant to say this earlier, that actually was really interesting, was he was written there the way you would expect Superboy to be written. Like he felt the characterization felt far more in keeping with the prior iteration. I'm not saying it didn't reflect where he was at all. It was kind of an interesting blend, I felt. And that was kind of my read on it, where it still felt like the Connor who was in Teen Titans, but it also still felt like the Connell we had before. So that was a really, really interesting side of all of this. And then one last thing about Infinite Crisis, it really did break my heart when they're at that multiversal tower and Nightwing's like, don't you have tactile telekinesis? Can't you? He's like, it's too big. It's like, God damn it. This is the time. This is when we need the tactile TK. One of the last things I wanted to hit on here, and originally I was planning for this to kind of be its own episode, but I have not seen enough of Young Justice and I have not seen enough of Titans. And in the future I will, and we'll do more dedicated coverage either here or on Patreon. But I have seen the first couple seasons of Young Justice, and I rewatched a couple of key episodes, and I did watch essentially Connor's intro episode of Titans. And I also did revisit the Scion episode of Smallville because I guested on a recent episode of Always Hold On to Smallville, and we talked all about that. So, by the way, if you want like 2 hours on Scion, go over to Always Hold On to Smallville and give it a listen. It was really fun. But I guess looking at those 3 adaptations, some of the things that stand out to me, and of course I welcome your thoughts as well, but in all of them, we're totally divorced from Superboy arising from the death of Superman and the need to replace Superman immediately. And Smallville is particularly fascinating in that respect, I feel, because there it's really an inversion. It's there. He starts off as Alexander Luthor. He's a clone of Lex to replace Lex. And then it turns out that they had used Clark's DNA. And so that DNA emerges and we have the shift to Connor. So it's really an inversion of that typical setup. That episode was great because you really get to see Clark in Big Brother mode. And that, when we look at the comics and the adaptations, that one is really an outlier where he's in Big Brother mode from the start, it was always nice to see. The weird thing about that episode, and if you may recall this, but Lionel Luthor exposes Connor to red kryptonite. And it gets, and Red K Connor sets his sights on Lois and he abducts her and it's very sexually threatening and it's very off-putting. And that aside, they kind of attribute that to, that's the Lex side. The red kryptonite brought out the Lex side. And I'm saying, watching this back in the day and rewatching it now for Zach's show, I'm saying to myself, like, but Lex wasn't a rapist. I mean, Jesus Christ. So that was a little weird, but overall, and that's the only episode that Connor appeared on the show. I know the season 11 comics would do more with him, but mostly I was just kind of struck by that inversion of the typical setup, you know?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting way to do it. And I think probably necessary because in that version, and it's the only version, Clark is not Superman. Right? In every other version where we have Connor, Clark is fully Superman and Superman for a while. And so when Connor arises, you have Clark reacting to him as Superman. Whereas in Smallville, he's just reacting to him as Clark. So he can take on more of that big brother role. I think that both Young Justice, the animated series, not the comic, and the Titans live action show, they both did with Connor, I think, what you would need to do with him when you really don't have the ability to introduce him using the death of Superman. That would have been wildly inappropriate for either of those shows, as much as it would have held true to the comics. Like, those are 2 shows that are not about the Justice League. They're not about the old guard. They're about the new kids. So there is a certain amount of streamlining that you have to do to that origin to introduce him, to give him some of the same pathos that we get from him in the comics, but without the 10 years of baggage that was necessary to get him to that point in the comics. So I always really liked him, particularly on Young Justice. I mean, that series is just a masterpiece. I thought that what they managed to do with him there was, it felt like Connor. It sounded like Connor. He had the same fears and doubts that our comic book Connor counterpart has. He doesn't have Crypto, but he has Wolf. Right? He's got this big white wolf as his sort of companion. They develop a relationship, which is really nice. I loved particularly the animated version. I really enjoyed the Titans version. That one I've only seen once, so it's hard to comment too specifically on it. But the animated series I've watched a few times, and I think Connor's great in it.
I have to say, watching the Connor episode of Titans and then rewatching a few select Young Justice episodes, overall I enjoyed their presentation of the character, with the caveat of what I said before, that we're really jettisoning that first iteration. But for a variety of reasons, for purposes of adaptation, I think this made sense. And to your point, I mean, they're totally divorced from the death of Superman, but I think it shows the viability of just this concept. And you don't really need the death of Superman, crazy for me to say, but it's true. Like, this notion of we need a clone of Superman in case we ever need to replace him, or in case he ever goes bad. Right. And I guess in looking at those 2 in particular, both out of Cadmus, both get him in the t-shirt and jeans right away. Both don't drag out the mystery of who he's cloned from in Titans, you know it right from the jump, and he knows it right
Yeah.
from the jump. In Young Justice, they know by the Agendas episode of the first season. So it's not something that they drag out, and understandably so, right? Because the audience knows, so it would just sort of be, the characters being behind. So, I mean, like those adaptations really do feel like they're born right out of these stories that we've been talking about here. A couple of things that stood out, the Young Justice iteration, especially early on, I mean, really leans into just like angry, aggressive Connor. But I know that show runs almost 100 episodes. I know at one point he dies or seemingly dies, then he ends up in the Phantom Zone, then he comes back. I know his relationship with McGonn, Miss Martian, is a huge part of his arc. And I know he does evolve and change over the course of that time. So I don't want to judge that entire show's version of him just based on that first season. But yeah, it was very angry aggro. I thought, once again, I was watching Superman and Lois season 4. I would love to see that Lex and this Superboy together. And then on the Titans front, what I did think was interesting was the fact that he has these embedded memories. And so he's getting flashes of the farm with Martha, and he's getting flashes of Lex's upbringing with Lionel, and actually goes to the Luthor farm and has this interaction with Lionel. So like that aspect was interesting. The thing that bothered me, and I guess they don't have much of a way around this, but with both Young Justice and Titans, there's no meaning behind why they call him Connor. I mean, there is a meaning, but it's like very superficial, where on Titans, he grabs some security guard's uniform and it just says Connor on it. So, I'm Connor. And then in Young Justice, there's an episode where he and Miss Martian are going to go to school and they need aliases. And she just goes, "Oh, I always like the name Connor." And then Martian Manhunter suggests Kent because, of course, he knows Clark Kent, but they play it as, like Kent Nelson, the Dr. Fate.
Right, Dr. Fate.
But yeah, it's like, what the hell?
Well, but realistically, how else do you do that? Like, again, there's so much buildup that you would need to establish the moment where Superman bestows upon him the name Con-El to honor the Kryptonian side of his heritage and all that. To have that moment pay off in the way that I think you and I would have liked it to pay off, so much ground laying would have been necessary. And they just, again, it's not the focus of those shows to do that. So they needed to just get through with it so that from that point on, they can refer to him as Connor. So I was able to forgive both of those for that reason, because I just understood it sort of as a practical consideration of like, we just need people to call him Connor because that's his name. How he'll get there is less important. But I agree with you. I think there is an added specialness to his connection to Superman and the Kryptonian legacy to have that name bestowed upon him, to then sort of give him an English version of that with Connor and all that. I agree, but I'm definitely forgiving of it.
Yeah, it's fine. It's just him getting that name was such a big deal in the comic, and just in his overall journey, it was a very seminal moment. But this was the Geoff Johns Teen Titans run. Obviously, we weren't pouring through every aspect, especially aspects that didn't pertain particularly to Connor. But I really enjoyed this. Is there anything we didn't say or talk about that you wanted to before we sign off?
No, I think we exhausted all my notes. It was just so fun, and it reminded me why I love this particular period in DC, that early 2000s era, where for me, even though I was a little bit older, I was discovering DC in the early 2000s the way that I had discovered Marvel in the early 90s. So, this was a blast, and getting to chat with you about it is always super fun. So thank you.
Awesome. Folks, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this break with the second half of our double feature and the conclusion of All-Star Superboy. Fat Moose Comics, established in 1982, is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Led by current owner Sean Hendricks, Moose has that rare, old-school comic shop feel and camaraderie, yet also remains a welcoming space for new fans. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you are in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. We all love the big-budget superhero films, but the world of independent cinema remains a place of unbridled creative freedom and entrepreneurial spirit. Whether you're an independent filmmaker yourself, or you just love movies, don't miss these New Jersey film festivals. Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, and Round Reel in Bloomfield. Submission information for filmmakers can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and much more. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations, Harrison, New York, Muncie, Indiana, or Skokie, Illinois, home to our pal, Sweet Sweet Bernie. If you have children and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow them on social media. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. My love of the TV series Smallville is well documented, and there's one Smallville podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring great insight, passion, and humor to each and every episode, and the podcast will continue with more great Smallville and Superman talk even after their series coverage concludes. Listen wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On To banner, including Arrow, Star Wars, and more. And now, joining me to discuss the Adventure Comics arc by Geoff Johns and Francis Manapul, as well as the solo Superboy series by Jeff Lemire and Pier Gallo, is first-time guest, Adam Daltorio. Welcome.
Hello.
I'm honored to have you here. I'm glad that we could connect.
I'm happy to be here. Yes, absolutely.
I got to tell you, these Superboy stories that we're here to talk about for this episode, this is the little sliver of time following Connor's resurrection in the pages of Final Crisis, Legion of Three Worlds, and before his erasure from continuity in the New 52.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just this 3-year period or so, 2008, 2009 to 2011, and we're looking at this pair of stories. And I have to say, over the course of these episodes, we've looked at Connor's journey from the beginning, and I've enjoyed the ride. But these stories that we looked at now, I think they represent my favorite slice of Connor Kent.
I agree. And I was a little hesitant even saying yes to this episode. And I'll tell you, because I don't consider myself a Superboy guy. I actually like any character who's like not a sidekick, but like what would be the term of like a branch off of a bigger property. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Your Wonder Girl, Aqualad, even like John Kent, they all have an uphill battle for me for caring about them, I guess. I tend to value what's unique about a person, and if they have the same symbol and similar powers, it's tough for me to get into. But I did want to come on here and make the case of like, this is why this is my Superboy. Even when like the 90s are kind of back, and I think a lot of kids are actually going to be mad at us to say like t-shirt era over jacket era, believe it or not. But I did want to make my case of like why this means something to me, I guess.
Right on. Well, then, yeah, you were the perfect one for this. So, like I said, we have this arc in the relaunched Adventure Comics in 2009, issues 1 through 6, or if we're going by the legacy numbering, 504 through 509. And this was the Boy of Steel arc by Geoff Johns and Francis Manapul. And of course, Geoff Johns had done a ton of work with Connor, reinventing him for the Teen Titans series, which we talked about in the first segment in this episode. And then, of course, it was under the pen of Geoff Johns that Connor met his end in the pages of Infinite Crisis, and then was unpaused and returned in the pages of Final Crisis, Legion of Three Worlds. And then this Boy of Steel arc brings him back to Smallville, living with Ma, a relatively recently widowed Ma on the farm, along with Crypto. And we start meeting members of our new supporting cast, who will continue to be fleshed out in the pages of the subsequent Superboy series. And I would say the main hook of this Boy of Steel arc is that Superboy is maintaining a list. All of the things that Superman did, all of the things that Lex Luthor did, and he's checking them off as he's going about his return to Smallville, right? What does Superman do? He lived on the farm with the Kents. He went to Smallville High. He looked out for his friends. What did Lex Luthor do? Lied to Superman. And essentially the secret that Superboy is keeping from Superman in these issues is he's looking for Lex, not to bring him in per se, but to try to determine whether or not there is any good within him, which harkens back to the central question that 50% of him comes from Superman, 50% comes from Lex Luthor, and that whole nature versus nurture. Is he born bad? Does he just have this evil inside him? So it's a great hook and a great setup for this. I enjoyed it at the time. We've looked at it a couple of times in past episodes, especially when we've looked at Lex over the years and how Lex has evolved. So we've looked at these stories, not too long ago, but I always have such a blast. And I know I always zero in on the writing side of whatever it is we're talking about, but good Lord, this Francis Manapul art is some of my all-time favorite comic book art in everything. It is mesmerizing. It is so gorgeous.
You know what happened is I knew we were doing this story, and I was like, God, I love Francis Manapul. And I think that I must have picked this up originally because of him. And it made me go like, is he a top 10 artist for me? And I did like make a list, and he ended up being like number 7, which is pretty good, top 10 of all time. So he's so unique. And the weird thing is he's got one of those styles that I think could fit every superhero, but stylized enough that I don't even know who to compare him to. You know what I mean? Like Dan Mora right now, he can fit every superhero, I think. But you can say he can do that because he's Jim Lee for millennial and Gen Z taste. Manapul is like, I think he can do it all, but I can't even guess who his influences are, really.
Yeah, it's such a standout. But yeah, this arc is a favorite. And when I say that this era in particular, if we can even call it an era, it's such a small slice of time, but a critical one. But I think for me, and I welcome your thoughts on this, I think for me, the reason why I really gravitated to these stories so much was that we talked previously about how with the launch of Teen Titans, we had this big shift with Superboy. And we debated whether or not it was a natural evolution or more of a hard reset of the character. But I feel like here in these stories, to me, where Connor is and what Connor is going through felt like a natural progression based on what he had experienced in Teen Titans, his death and return. The fact that where previously he had this very antagonistic relationship towards his home in Smallville, now he appreciates it. He can't believe he ever hated living there. He looks at it as this opportunity for a little bit of normality amidst everything else going on in his life. So that newfound appreciation tract, the fact that he spent most of that Teen Titans run trying to deny this Lex Luthor revelation about his DNA. And now after being controlled and puppeteered by Lex in that Insiders arc, and again, his death and return, to now be at a point where he wants to learn if there's any redeeming value in this guy. Now it's not just about kind of suppressing this, but actually trying to explore and get some answers for himself. It just felt like a very natural progression. And we've talked a lot about the various settings and supporting casts that that Superboy has had over the years, some more effective than others, but the Smallville setting itself, but beyond that, the fact that now in the Adventure Comics arc and then the solo Superboy series, we're populating this new world for him with Simon Valentine and Lori Luthor and Psionic Lad and of course Ma and Crypto, and just building out this world for him. It felt like a great fit. So those are really those two reasons why for me, this arc and this era generally are the sweet spot. How about for yourself? What stands out to you? What do you want to talk about?
The list is the big thing. I definitely, this read through, I did have more appreciation for the side characters, as you said. I do feel like I like Hawaii a little bit more, just as like an idea. I like him being in Hawaii more than Smallville. That hasn't changed. My opinion hasn't changed on that. Just because, like I said, I just value the uniqueness of it.
Yeah.
But like you said, the main hook is the list. And just a more shallow note, I think the T-shirt work worked for me. I guess the simplicity of it. I think it felt like it wasn't like trying too hard. I guess. You know what I mean? It didn't feel too like edgy. But I was trying to think back, and the list idea is so simple too. And it's a very, I wrote like succinct. Like I feel like Johns is very succinct writer. And it's a very simple, like kind of devil and angel on your shoulder kind of idea. And I love when Superman stories in general kind of take like those ideas like that and have a sci-fi twist. I think that's kind of what Siegel and Schuster did, and that's in a way like kind of continues. I don't know how much to get into.
Yeah, well, we'll get into as much depth as you would like, but I agree, and I think when you talk about the simplicity of it, I think there's something to that, and especially when you see these items on the list start to rack up, but they are all very fundamental or elemental, right? Joined a team, and you see a shot of Clark with the Legion of Superheroes, and then Connor with the Titans. Died and came back to life, and you see Clark and Doomsday, and you see Superboy and Superboy Prime. It really has, and I think it is especially effective given that this is a reintroduction of the character. He just came back to life in Legion of Three World, but now we're actually settling in and spending time with him. So for people who for all of us who had been away from the character or potentially new readers, I think it was a great introduction, and it gave you a lot of the kind of the key beats of where he had been. But yeah, it really, I think for both Superboy and Superman, Lex, like it just really kind of got at these core fundamental aspects of each of them. It was very effective.
Yes, in a new way too. I will say I think this hit me so hard at the time too, because this is not like boo-hoo, woe is me, but I think it happened. I must have read it the same year my parents got divorced. And so a lot of stories about duality really hit me hard. And that Superman stuff is so great for that, right? And now this is the first time I'm reading it that I have kids and that I'm very aware of. I don't want to be like my dad, as I'm sure a lot of, dads can relate to. And so I was going into it very much of the mindset of like, I think the Lex Luthor stuff is going to hit me harder. And I will say that my first criticism of the book is I don't think the Lex Luthor side of the list has enough on it. It felt like the Superman side was very padded, and that's not the side that needed to be padded.
I don't disagree. I think there's something to that. I was thinking about that myself as well.
Yeah.
And I'm even trying to think about what was on the list. I know when he's getting ready for his date with Cassie, he's looking in the mirror, and one of the things is, go bald.
Sure.
And then he's nervous about reuniting with Cassie, and Ma has a line about, I don't think I ever saw Clark get this worked up about a girl. So if memory serves, I don't know if he put that in the Lex column for a moment or something like that, or was at least considering it. It was something like that.
Yeah.
Right. And then alienating friends.
Yeah. It was like bad with girls ?
Yeah. And then alienating friends was another thing. That might have been when he was talking with Simon and he had to duck out to go into action. I might be mixing up the instances, but yeah, overall, I think
he crossed it out.
Yes.
Go on. Sorry.
Yeah, no, but I know. I think there's probably a little bit more that could have been fleshed out. I will say I remember reading this for the first time and when it starts off with all of this, with a number of the Superman items. And then the first time we get a Lex entry, it really is a surprise. And I remember my first instinct was, is he purposely trying to do these things? Like, what's the angle here? But I think ultimately it's more of this inventory, right? As he's just trying to see what he's doing and all of that. So, but yeah, it was a cool setup for this.
Yes.
I also have to say, because I don't want to forget this, maybe my favorite moment in that Adventure Comics arc is a misguided Crypto rounding up Superboy's old rogues gallery and plopping them in Smallville. Amazing.
Very good. Yeah. I didn't know there was, I went away from this like, this is a better Crypto story than I remember.
Yeah.
And that was a kind of a nice, because Crypto's kind of having a year, So this was a very nice, like, oh, next time I have to recommend a Crypto story, I got to remember this.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it's such a funny gag, but then Superboy chastises him for it. He's like, bad dog, this is dangerous. This is blowing my profile. He's like, some of these people reformed. One of them was already in prison. And then, of course, he sees the sadness in Crypto and apologizes. And you see where Connor is coming from, that he's just trying to keep everybody safe and protect this new life that he's building. But it was a great moment for the two of them, for Crypto. It was humorous, at least the setup of it. And it was also kind of a nice callback to where Superboy has been. And a lot of those, the Hawaii adventures where we have Scavenger and King Shark and Silver Sword and whatnot. So I thought it was a nice nod. And also, it's funny, looking at all of these Superboy stories, this is now the third version of Crypto that he's been with. Because first we had the Earth Canine that Bibbo had
Bibbo's Crypto.
That Bibbo sent over. And then there was a brief period of time where we had a superpowered Crypto, but that was the Crypto from the Silver Agey Krypton from the Phantom Zone, from the Jeff Loeb, Joe Kelly era.
Okay.
But now we're in the post-Crisis era, in the post-Superman Secret Origin version. So now we're dealing with the actual Crypto from Krypton.
The
real Crypto.
It feels like now official Crypto.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just funny that this Superboy, he's had a Crypto almost all the way through. It's a different one.
It's a little funny. He's not like, which Crypto? He's not saying like, isn't this number 3?
Yeah, it's amazing. And the other thing too that I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight, and this goes for both the Boy of Steel and the solo Superboy series. I love the space that these stories create for Martha. And we talk about these little pockets of time. This is relatively short period where Martha is alive, but Jonathan has died. He died at the end of the Brainiac arc by Geoff Johns and Gary Frank in the post-Infinite Crisis pre-52 landscape. And so you have Martha widowed, alone on the farm, and then Superboy moves back and she's so welcoming of having him in the house. She's like, Jonathan always hated a quiet house. And especially as we move forward, there are numerous instances where she's giving him counsel and being that sounding board for him. And then as the supporting cast begins to grow, there's a point where she's making dinner for Psionic Lad and Simon Valentine. And even in this first arc, she makes dinner for Connor and Cassie and then puts it in a picnic basket for Crypto to bring out to them so they can have some privacy. It's just one of those things where if we're going to kill off Pa, like we did in that Brainiac storyline, well, it's like, all right, well then what opportunities does that create? And I think hand in hand with Pa being off the board, but then also having Superboy living on the farm, it's like now you have a role for her. She has something to do. Like I really like that.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of good moments, a lot of good quiet moments with her too. Again, like talking about how well Manapul is. She never has like a monologue about how much she misses Pa. I think you bring up a good point. It's a lot of not background, but you can just intuit it, and they trust you to intuit it. A lot of her story. It worked very well, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And throughout the story, I know we're building towards the big Lex moment, but the moments that he has, the scenes with Cassie where they have their picnic and they reconnect, and then when he tracks down Tim in Paris, who's on his own quest to try to track down Bruce Wayne, who seemingly died in Final Crisis, but of course we know he's just bouncing through time and all of that. But what did you make of the Cassie and Tim moments?
So it was definitely a moment to show how much he's matured, right? Because we're talking about Cassie kissed Tim while he was dead. And again, maybe a lesser writer would be like, here's juice for melodramatics. And it was a very adult, hey, you know what happens? I was gone. I really like that a lot. And I'm not even like particularly rooting for that couple or anything, but it just felt because it was so subdued, it feels more real. I can, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no,
I agree. It didn't feel like a CW thing, I guess.
Yeah, I was very impressed. I totally I agree with you, and I like the way that played out. Where it would have been very easy to mine that for the dramatics, but instead, he was very mature. And it felt believable. And when he says he was like,
believable is a good word.
And when he says I was dead, I was underground. I can't hold this against you. And even beyond that, he's like, I'm just so happy to be alive. Like I can get past this. Yeah, I really liked that mature response that he had to. Like it just was this non-issue. And then even when he tracks down Tim and Tim's like, oh, I gotta tell you, he's like, no, I already know. Like we're good. It was great. No, the Connor and Cassie stuff was one. It was a really, really sweet romantic scene with the two of them. And then eventually you realize, they're on that picnic table and eventually they're up in the sky. And it's a great moment. It just bums me out. I like that pairing, and they end up breaking up in the pages of Teen Titans, which is referenced in the Jeff Lemire series, but we don't see that play out in the stories that we looked at here. So it's kind of a bummer. Like we were reintroduced to them as a couple, and then it just kind of went away. But it was a really beautiful moment, I thought, between the two of them. And the Tim stuff was great as well. I love that dynamic between the two of them. And I always, it's like Tim Drake. He a bit misguided when he was trying to bring back Connor while Connor was was dead. But as far as tracking down Bruce, I will always give credit to Tim. He was one of the only ones, maybe the only one. He was right. Everyone's mourning Bruce, and he knew Bruce was out there.
That's true. And I'll say too, with the Connor thing, I did even like the line. It was like, I knew it wouldn't be you, but it's something. That kind of hit. So I don't know.
I know.
I do think it is a little crazy to think that Omega beams would send Bruce back in time, even if he was right. It's a wild assumption. He was a skeleton, wasn't he?
True.
He was right. I can't argue with it, but
yeah, I know. But it was, by any estimation, it was definitely a leap at the time based on the evidence that they had. But no, I love their heart to heart, and Connor confides in him about this list that he's keeping. So, a really great one. And then at the very end of this arc, we have a reunion of our core quartet from Young Justice / Teen Titans, where they have that campfire, right? Connor and Tim and Cassie and Bart as well. So I'm always happy to see those guys together. So I guess this is a great opportunity to talk a bit more about Lex, right? And there's a point early on where Connor goes to the old Luthor house and encounters Superman. And it just, Connor asks Clark, essentially, do you think it would have made a difference if, for example, the Kents had raised Lex? Right. And Superman's like, no. And that's all well and good. And we get where Clark is coming from, but it's one of these things. It's like, to read the room. Like, why do you think this kid is asking you this? It's like, you could throw him a bone here.
Yeah. That also, I'm sorry to give this is a tangent, but Superman 175 is a very good Silver Age story. That's one where Lex is raised by the Kents.
Ah, right on. Yeah, I have not read that one. I got to check that one out.
It's very good. It's very good. But yeah, it very. And the weird thing is, though, I do agree with Superman. I kind of like. I actually like a Lex that is just bad. But yeah, you're right. It's like, just tell him that he's going to be okay, I guess.
Yeah, give him something. Like, just try. Yeah, but he's really oblivious.
That almost makes me think of, like, I'm sure you might have talked about this in the previous segment, but like the idea that this is not a father-son relationship. I very much was not getting that in this scene, and it wasn't a very. Superman wasn't rude here, obviously, but when you talk about like comforting, I didn't see this as comforting someone. Right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And I think we're in agreement on this. I've never looked at Clark Connor as a father-son dynamic, as much as I know it's often kind of said, oh, Clark and Lex are his two fathers. It's like, yes, they provide the genetic material. And of course, with Lex, there is more of that, a very twisted version of that dynamic. But but with Clark, I always looked at them more as more of like a brotherly or cousin. Maybe they start off as cousins and then they become brothers.
Yeah, it's like brothers, but like your mom had the kid when you were out of the house.
Yeah.
It's a very I don't think it diminishes anything to say that they're not as close as Batman and Robin.
No, absolutely. And so eventually Connor will get his wish. He will get the opportunity to come face to face with Lex. We're introduced to the character Lori, one of Connor's classmates. And she's vandalizing the local doctor's office. And she's talking about how her mom needs all this medical care and the insurance ran out and the doctor wouldn't treat her. And we find out that Lori's mother is Lena Luthor, sister of Lex. And while all of this is happening, Lex is coming after Superboy. Lex is broken out of prison. He's aligned with Brainiac. And so one of the issues, our big reveal at the end, is that there's a knock on the door of Lori's house, and she opens the door, Uncle Lex, and he's got kryptonite ready for Connor because he's tracked Connor to the house. Side note, in this story, there's a little bit of business about Project Alien Farm, this cloning experiment that Lex is performing, right? Where he's creating something. He mentions it being family. He mentions using different DNA that he did in the past. We see an arm at one point, and it's green. Maybe he's cloning a Brainiac of some sort. I'm not sure, but to my knowledge, this never paid off. Am I correct?
I think you're right, because his daughter, who he gave to Brainiac, that already happened.
Yeah.
Correct? So his daughter Brainiac is done. She's now human at this point, correct?
Oh, God.
Because that made me think like, oh, that's his daughter, but that was like, no, that happened in 2000.
All right. So, boy, you're going to get me going on this. So
okay, go ahead.
So, yeah, he had given his daughter to Brainiac 13. Right. Eventually, she came back as an older version of herself. But at the end of Our Worlds at War, Superman had done whatever he had to do and was able to return an infant Lena to Lex.
Right.
And he basically says, like, you have another chance now. We're small men in a vast universe. Don't screw this up. And then we see Lena like a few times leading up to Infinite Crisis, but not much. But we see baby Lena a few times. And then post Infinite Crisis, she's never seen or heard from again until very recently in the Superman books, when she shows up as a teenager, and it turns out she's been in hiding on some island or something like that. So like at this point in continuity in the post Infinite Crisis landscape, I don't think she existed. I mean, now based on current stories, they've now apparently she was around the whole time, but at this point, I don't think that was a thing.
Well, then I guess I'll say my guess was that was going to be John's reworking the idea. Because I think you're right that there was kind of a soft reset, and maybe it was like, I do kind of want to keep that. That's my guess. Yeah. That's just where my mind went when I saw the panel.
Yeah. But no, I was digging around, I was looking on Reddit threads, but I don't think this ever paid off. This is a dangling thread out there. Maybe someone will do something with this. But yeah, so from this point forward, when we finally have Connor and Lex together in the house. So what was your reaction to how this all played out between them?
I loved it. So this is where I was talking about, like the Lex list being a little light. This is where it hit hard, and especially when I was a kid and he throws Lex out of the building. That was, I remember, like the moment when I was like, oh, he's not like Superman. And now that I'm older, I know Superman has plenty of moments of like that too. But and then he writes on the list like Lex Luthor just, I don't remember the wording, but has no mercy for his enemies or something.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't that harsh, but that is like there's the Lex list. There's what I want from the story. Yeah, and like I said, I love just a bad guy Lex. Even if we can like go back a little bit, because we were talking about the father relationship. When Brainiac was like, oh, I know you must have some sort of paternal feelings. And Lex's quote is like, no, ownership. And I love this relationship. It's a great, great story.
I agree. And also just the relationship between Lex and Brainiac. There's this great moment once the battle is done and Brainiac and Lex are leaving, where Brainiac says, we've learned all, or there won't be any more learning today, right? And from Brainiac's perspective, he means we've gathered all of the knowledge we can from this situation. And Lex responds, he's like, yeah, like we can't teach them anything else, right? For Lex, it's about what he's proving to Connor, right? For Brainiac, it's about what Brainiac is absorbing. I kind of like that point of contrast between the two of them. But yeah, this was a fascinating Lex piece here, where he's reunited with his sister Lena, and you might think that this would conjure some warm feelings or some compassion or some humanity, and maybe there's a little bit of a hint of it, but ultimately we're kind of in the traditional Lex mode of, I could do all of these things. I would do all of these things. I would cure famine, disease, hunger, if not for Superman. And Connor calls him out, calls his bluff, essentially. Yeah. He's like, you're always saying that, but you know what? Right now, Superman's off-world because we're in New Krypton territory at this point. He's like, Superman's not here. Prove this. Look, your sister is in a wheelchair. She's having all of these issues. Help her. And so Lex agrees and sends Superboy on this whole quest to track down all of the ingredients for whatever concoction he's putting together. So they go to prehistoric times and they're running from dinosaurs. They go to Atlantis. They go to Paradise Island.
Great page, yeah.
Yeah, like it's a ton of fun. I mean, my God, that could have been its own arc, you know, this quest. And then Lex does it. Right? He injects Lena with this formula, and she stands up and she's thinking and speaking clearly. And before we get to the payoff of it, which of course people familiar with the story already know where this is going, but I think this had to be the case for this specific story. So I don't have any issues here, but there is a part of me that in my view of Lex, I kind of gravitate towards the version or just the idea that, yeah, he always says he can do these things, but can he really? Right. And this, according to this, it's like, no, he can. Like, he really can.
I like to think he always can.
Yeah.
I like to think of him as equal to Superman. But I think that comes to that. That's like the Bronze Age kind of guy in me. I'm much more leaning towards like Megan Lex Luthor absolutely can do it. Silver Age, Bronze Age Lex Luthor absolutely can do it. I'm not so much of a Byrne Lex Luthor guy. So gotcha. I very much like when he just can do anything.
Gotcha. And there's this great moment here where I believe it's Superboy, or one of them says it's a miracle. And we get the great line, yes, miracles don't exist, but Lex Luthor does. It's but Lex giveth and Lex taketh away, because he injects her with another formula and she's back in the chair. He undoes this cure. Because for him, it was just about proving that he could. And he says, when Superman's dead, then I'll cure her for real. I mean, it's so cold. It's so cruel. And it's one of those things. It's funny because I think if I'm reading this from the perspective of Lex Luthor, if I'm reading this as a Lex Luthor story, I always like some at least potential for redemption. The Smallville fan in me, if nothing else, I'm always like, oh, he's the guy. Like he helped Clark down from the when he was a Scarecrow. But if you're looking at this from this point of view, from Connor's as a Superboy story, it's perfect because this gives Connor the answer he was looking for, right? And the list becomes moot at this point because he's like, well, I could never do that. Like I could never be that cold and that cruel. So this fear that he has, ultimately realizes like, no, I'm not this guy. I would never do that. So I like the payoff of it.
Here's what I'll say about Lex's characterization. Because I have always had in my mind, same as you, I was like, oh, this is kind of a weird moment for Lex because he's so cold. And Lena's the sister's name, right? As well as the daughter.
Yep.
Lena has kind of always been okay, this is where we will show Lex's humanity. And even in Geoff Johns' Justice League run, he does that. So it's been in my memory of like, this is a weird moment where it has to be for this story. But in this read through, I was like, oh, he does care for Lena here. And the nuance is, but what are his priorities? And it was very much reminiscent of Action Comics 900. If you know what I'm talking about, when he has like the God powers, it's like, this is one of the defining moments for me.
Yes.
It's that choice of like solve everything or kill Superman. If you try to kill Superman, your powers go away, and you see where it's going. So that was very much yes, he does care about Lena, but his ego it's always going to be more important to him. Always. And that to me is why he is a good villain. I'm not against like showing humanity in him, but that is why he works, I think. It depends on his moment. Yeah.
No, I think that's the way to look at this. Yeah, I agree. It's not that there's no feeling for her. There's at least one because there's a point where Lena says like, I'm glad Dad's not here anymore. right? Something to that of like, thanks for, you always looked out for me, something like that. And there's the panel where it's like, this is registering to him.
Yes.
But I think you're spot on. I think ultimately it's everything else just supersedes that. Like it cannot, he just can't overcome that. So it's like, but they're both there, but the other one is just so much more powerful. So
that's a great way to put it, is he can't help himself. Yeah.
I mean, I've always been a fan of this arc, and I think more so each time I go back to it, it's really a delight. I wish it were in print. It's available on the app, but the trade is long out of print. It's due for another edition, I would say, because it's a great story. Anything we didn't say about the Boy of Steel before we shift gears and talk a bit about that Jeff Lemire series?
No, because I think we'll be in good shape to talk about the supporting cast. Might be better to talk about in Lemire series.
Yeah, no, I agree. So I got to say, I read, this 11 issue series only ran 11 issues because then we were right into Flashpoint and the New 52 and this went away. And if memory serves, because at this point in time, I had switched over to reading exclusively in trade. So I wasn't buying books monthly, but I was picking up collected editions. And I do believe I read this trade. It's called Smallville Attacks, which is the name of the first arc here. And I think I read this when around the time it came out, and I liked it well enough, but it didn't make that much of an impression on me. And I never went back to it in all of these years. And I reread it now. I'm like, oh, you dummy. Like you really slept on this. It was really good. What was your reaction to it?
So here's my list of favorite comic book writers. 1, Grant Morrison. 2, Jeff Lemire. So I actually do revisit this quite often because I'm like, I know Jeff Lemire wrote Superboy. let me come back to this. And I find that this is early Lemire. So in my mind, he's not experienced yet, and certainly not with superheroes. And I do always find like Lemire to me is his indie work is always going to be like 5 times better than his DC work. So I tend to feel like the first 2 issues are awesome, and then it's kind of disappoints me because I know how high that Jeff Lemire can get.
Okay. I get that. I mean, it is very strong out of the gate. I don't know that it quite sustains that all the way through. I'll be honest though, I've not read, I'm trying to think, I don't know that I've read much, if anything else, by him. There's no reason for it. It's not like I'm against reading his other stuff. I just don't know that I have. So this might be my main exposure to his work, but I guess what I really liked about this was just the further development of this new life for Connor, this setting and the supporting cast. And, one of the things that I think really highlights this for me is after the battles of the first couple of issues, the farmers' crops across town are destroyed. And Connor really takes this to heart. And he feels this responsibility and he wants to help the community. And a great moment with Martha where she's like, look, people in this town, like they rely on each other and they've gotten through a lot. He's like, Jonathan and I, we had times when we didn't know, we would make our mortgage payments. We always found a way. But essentially this idea of community and you can't do this all by yourself. And so then Connor has this idea to bring in Bart for a Superboy Kid Flash race to raise money for everyone. And so it was just like, that's one instance that I really gravitated towards because I feel like it just kind of encapsulated a lot about where he is and what matters to him. And also just that maturity, the fact that he, was taking this to heart the way that he was, which is great. So like, those are the aspects of it that I think I like the most, as opposed to the plot per se. There's all this business about the Hollow Men and the subterranean civilization under Smallville and this centuries long battle between Phantom Stranger and Thanorok. All fine, but it's the supporting cast and those character moments like really, I think, singing this,
Yes. I'll say too, the same way I'm like, last story was the first time I read it post having kids. This was the first time I've read this story post having watched Twin Peaks. Have you seen Twin Peaks?
I have not, no.
Okay, so you missed a lot. So in the first couple issues, he talks to a guy who's like whittling some little like weird monster thing. And he's like, do you know what today is? So that was David Lynch.
Okay.
And I almost like psyched myself out. I guess I'm like now kind of, I have to talk to your listeners because you're not, but I did not know that this whole run was a Twin Peaks homage. So he must have gotten the assignment. Hey, Lemire, you've done some good indie work about small towns. We're doing Superboy in a small town. And then he must have thought, what are good small town stories, and revisited Twin Peaks. I totally like gaslit myself into like, no, I'm crazy. That can't be David Lynch. It must just because he's top of mind, because me and a million other people are rewatching his movies right now. And I started going nuts, and I found like Jeff Lemire like drew some like Twin Peaks art, and he said that David Lynch is the most important artist to him. And I'm making this whole list of like, oh, and this panel he drinks coffee, and that's a Twin Peaks thing. And Simon's talking into a recorder, that's a Twin Peaks thing. And then by an issue like 9, he just says like, oh, Mr. Lynch. And I'm like, my whole kind of conspiracy board was just like, I thought I'd add something interesting for my first time on the show. But yeah, so that was a very I have a new appreciation for this run now that I know what he was doing.
You know what's funny? I'm actually glad I didn't know. I don't know if that would have made me appreciate it more. It might have gone the other way. So I'm actually glad that I just kind of took this for what it was. Here's the thing. I think the other reason why I gravitated to this so much as a massive Smallville fan, just the idea of like, there's weird stuff going on in this town.
Yes,
really felt like home to me. And this is a question that's come up, especially when we've talked about Smallville, is like, should Smallville really just be this peaceful, quaint aspect of his life, or should it be this like crazy gauntlet that he has to go through?
Right.
And we see stories on both sides of that, and I think both are valuable. But just this idea of like, there's weird stuff going on, I felt very at home with that. The other thing though, the audience here might be surprised, because I've made no secret of the fact I generally don't love the magic / supernatural based stories. For what, I don't know why, man, but like this one worked for me. I wasn't saying to myself, oh, what are we doing with this? No, I was on board. Like it really worked for me for whatever reason.
I'm kind of with you, but I'll add an extra annoyance is when they'll be like, ooh, this is magic plus science. Like that's its own kind of trope.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it feels like they think that's so clever every time. But again, I'm telling you, it was because he was like, I'm doing the Twin Peaks thing. I don't want to keep harping on this fact, but I think some people will appreciate it. I think he was essentially, this isn't going to make sense to you, but the Phantom Stranger and remind me the name of the arch enemy.
I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, but Thanarok.
That they were basically his like version of the Lodge residents, which are these kind of supernatural beings in the Twin Peaks universe. And he was, so that's why I think it worked. You're right though. It is very weird when you add magic to Smallville specifically, because you're right. I think it should be kind of it should be middle of nowhere and feel like it and not be important. But you can't do that if you want to have a story there. So.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so maybe that's one of the reasons why I was okay with it. Cause it's like, well, then this allowed us to tell Smallville set stories. It wasn't like this is where he came to sleep and then he flew off and had other adventures. It's like, no, this is where he is. And on the note of the supporting cast, I mean, we had met Simon Valentine in a very young Lex Luthor-esque, very scientifically minded individual who has trouble connecting with others. Connor really becomes his main friend here, and a lot more play in these stories. But I like this dynamic between them. He very quickly puts 2 and 2 together that Connor is Superboy,
which made him a little bit of a like Pete Ross type character too.
Dude, so I have this whole thing, many episodes. I am on my Justice for Pete Ross campaign. I feel like this guy gets left in the dust and he's been through a lot and he deserves better. I had forgotten he pops up here. It seems like he's a teacher at the high school, because when they're at the race, he introduces himself. He's like, I'm Pete Ross from Smallville High.
Yeah.
he really gets after all the business with President Lex and Ruin and then divorcing Lana. I mean, there's, I know he ends up back in Smallville, but yeah, this seems to make it clear he's teaching at the high school. So this is like another little tiny
I think
chapter.
that's a nice spot for him.
Yeah.
I don't think he needs to be doing anything like super important. I think that's why he suffered, is because they tried to wedge him in too hard.
Yeah.
I kind of like him just being in Smallville, just having a low stakes life.
Yeah, fellow guest and podcaster Tyler Patrick, when we were talking about Superman for all seasons and the frustration that Pete feels because like Lana and Clark, they left where Pete wanted to leave, but he kind of got stuck in the town, right? And Tyler made the comparison. It's a Wonderful Life is one of my all time favorite movies, and he's like the George Bailey of Small. I'm like, oh yeah, like I really like that. So.
Yeah, that is good.
Yeah, the notion of him being there, being a teacher, but I just had forgotten he popped up in this. It's only like a few panels, but I'm like, oh, there he is. There's good old Pete. But with Simon, there's this great moment where, Simon's in his glory, like having someone to be friends with and helping Superboy in his adventures. But at the high school, Connor's like, look, you can't be part of both of my lives, right? Like if you're going to help me when I'm Superboy, we can't pal around at school. And it's a tough blow for it's hard for Connor to deliver this, and it's a tough blow for Simon to receive. And I just like the way it played. Like I said, you look at this character and clearly modeled after a young Lex, but I'm glad it didn't go that route. I mean, there's all this business when Psionic Lad shows up from the future, and ultimately we find out that in at least one potential timeline, Simon becomes this dictator. But
yes,
so there's
with with a suit that looks very much like Lex.
Yes, true.
Yeah, but go on.
No, so like that specter is hanging over everything, but I'm glad, at least in this short run that we had, that it didn't go down that road all the way. Like you see what he's able to bring to the table, and that goodness remained. I thought that was nice.
Yes. Yeah, this is one of the things I wanted to talk about that I appreciate now, because before rereading this, I think I would have just said, oh yes, Simon, I think I know, like he's just it's a common thing to, when you add a side character, make him the science guy, right? That's its own category. So like whatever. But on this read, I was really appreciating that what he is it's Connor's chance to do something better than what Clark did, which is like, this is a path that this character is on, is to become another Lex Luthor. And it goes back to the list thing of like, well, this is actually something that Connor doesn't even know. And I like that he doesn't know that he doesn't have that pressure of, I'm doing something that Clark did, but he is. And I think that the answer that we get at the end is, yes, this is a better friendship than Clark and Lex had.
Yeah. And you wonder like, why, right? It goes back to that old question, and something that we talked about a lot in all of our Smallville discussions. It's like, would it have made a difference if Clark had actually shared his secret with Lex and not gaslit him for all of those years? And so here you have an instance where he doesn't try to dissuade Simon or try to make him think like, no, I'm not actually Superboy. He, really kind of brings him in. So it was interesting. But no, I like the way that played out. And to your point, I was thinking about the television show This Is Us, which I don't know if you watched, but there's a great moment where Jack says to his son at one point, he's like, a kid can either repeat the mistakes of his old man or he corrects them. And so as you were saying that line kind of popped into my head, that it's like, yeah, here you have Connor in a similar sort of setup, a similar sort of dynamic with someone who could really go down a different path.
Yes.
And it doesn't go that way. And that friendship is much different. And yeah, I mean, you don't see Connor pushing him away or anything like that. Yeah, that was cool. Now we also have Lori Luthor. What's your read on Lori? Obviously we spent time with her in that first arc, but she continues to be a presence here.
Right. Oh boy. So this was very much so we'll get into it. It's getting more romantic, which was set up in the previous run. And now they're really talking about, are you my cousin? And it did make me feel like, boy, you've already talked about this on the show, is like, he's cursed to just have just weird relationships, things that will make you go like, that's not it. I don't know. And it's interesting. I don't think anything should be like off topics in a story, right? But it was also like, I don't think Jeff Lemire has an answer to this. And it's just very much like, but you're not really my cousin. It's just like, okay, but it's... But
no.
Do you want to keep talking about it or do you not want to keep talking about it? I don't know what the book wanted to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's I'm laughing because it's like, yeah, I don't think there is an answer. Like at one point, yeah, to your point, she says, yeah, no, we're not like cousins, but it's like, but based on what? I mean, you are.
But if they did make them go together, that would be all that anyone would talk about in the fandom, right?
Yeah.
And it'd be the same thing as Tanya Moon is like, there is something just odd. This isn't right?
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm glad that she is, she's the niece of Lex Luthor, who's his quote unquote father. So yeah, we have some shared DNA, however tenuous it might be, but there is something there. So yes, I think that probably would have dominated the conversation had they gone down that road.
That's the thing is like, I don't even know if this is worth bringing up, guys, because you don't seem to have a good story with it. It's just kind of a extra sauce, I guess. And it's just like, well, if you don't know, it's too pronounced of a problem to not go anywhere,
I hear you. I mean, I feel like, and I don't know, I haven't come across, I didn't specifically look, but I haven't come across any interviews where Lemire talked about what future plans he might have had the book continued. My gut is that we probably would have landed somewhere in the Roxy Leach camp where it becomes more of a brother-sister sort of thing, which probably would have been the right way to go. And maybe they could have gotten there even sooner and not even kind of dangled this potential romance. It's funny. I think that's probably one of the reasons why I like the Connor and Cassie setup so much, because it was one of the only love interests other than Serling Rockette at Cadmus. I was okay with her, but everyone else is like wildly age inappropriate or genetically related.
Cassie that relationship wins by default.
Yeah,
really. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but one of the things, and I don't know that I was even dialed into this when I read this for the first time, but rereading it, at the beginning of the first issue of this series, Superboy is sitting alone. Well, not totally alone. He has Crypto, but he's sitting with Crypto on the top of the water tower. Mm-hmm. And in the final issue, the final shot, it's him and Crypto on the water tower, but now surrounded by all their friends with Psionic Lad and Simon and Laura. And I just thought that was a beautiful full circle moment. And it's so bittersweet and it really frustrates me. And we could talk a little bit more about this, that this is right before he is just jettisoned from the DC universe and from continuity. And you know what? At the time, that might've been why I kind of read this and forgot about it, because I probably had a sense, conscious or otherwise, of like, well, this didn't really matter anyway.
This is filler now. Yeah.
Now going back to it, now my perspective has changed so much, and now I just look at these things for what they are in and of themselves, and so I get a lot more out of it. But yeah, there is still that bittersweet feeling of, wow, we set him up with this great group of people around him and this life and everything, and then it's like it's just gone. But that was a really nice. I really like the symmetry of that, the beginning and the end.
Yeah, and the covers too. Yes. Awesome covers. Yeah. Yeah,
they are gorgeous. And Francis Manapul did the variants, which were gorgeous as well, unsurprisingly.
Yeah. But it's tough because it's easy to blame the New 52 for stuff. But I do, like I said, I do look at this run and kind of be like, it was off the rails. And who knows what was going on? Who knows how much he had to rush. But rereading this, I was like, I do think this last issue is not a good final issue. I think it's a good final page. I was really struck with, for their finale, how little he has to do. It was a Phantom Stranger story, right?
Yeah.
And I think that Lemire got in his own way with trying to show off. Like I said, like this was, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure someone will, but I think this would have been his first DC book. Because I think his first book in general was like 2009.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think he got in his own way and got really excited and wanted to bring in Viking Prince and Orion and Phantom Stranger and show that he knew who Phantom Stranger fought in the 70s. And it became a Connor felt like a background by the end to me.
I hear you. I mean, I'll play devil's advocate. 11 is kind of a weird number to go out on. So I'm gonna hope and say that maybe there was at least one more issue of runway that he thought he had, and then this had to get really truncated. But I don't know. It's these problems might still have been there anyway. I know we haven't talked super specifically about the plot of this. It's I don't know how worth it is to really lay all of it out. But I mean, essentially the gist of it, as I mentioned earlier, is that, and this, of course, we come to find much deeper into the story, but there's been this centuries-long conflict between Thanarok and Phantom Stranger, where Thanarok's whole objective throughout time seems to be to create this army that then he will fill with the souls of the people above. But Phantom Stranger is always there to stop him. And eventually Smallville becomes the site of his next, desired conquest. And he employs this clan, the Tooks, Ibn Took and his crew, from Smallville in the 1800s, and they make this deal for immortality. And they and these golems end up populating this subterranean civilization underneath Smallville. And early on in the series, there's this device that seemingly explodes while Connor is holding it. It turns out it was mapping his physiology, and Connor becomes the template for this army of clones that Thanarok wants to fill with the souls of the people of Smallville. And as I am saying this, I am saying to myself, Adam's right. This really did go off the rails. This is a weird.
I actually, as you're saying it, my thought is, if people are just listening and didn't read along, I do think it was executed better than it sounds.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Did my best. Yeah, because there's a mystery aspect to it, right? Like I'm kind of reverse engineering it and kind of just laying out what was going on. But
this was revealed over time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
it's a pretty cool, I think, like motivation for a villain too. It's just trying to get an army started up is kind of an interesting place for a villain to be at.
Yeah.
Yeah, but again, when I think of this run, I really love like 3 issues. It's the first 2 issues and the race is what you should read if you're just listening to this.
Yeah, the race was a lot of fun. I guess we won't spoil who wins the race. You should go check that out.
It's a very good answer.
Yeah, I was cool with it. Oh, and then the other thing I did like though in the climax of all of this, when Superboy sees all of these copies of himself, right? These lifeless husks, and he doesn't want to leave them behind. I mean, there's this sense of connection. He's like, well, I came out of a test tube. And, everyone around him is like, no, but you have a mind, you have a soul, you're a person, right? Which is a central question that's been hanging over him.
Yeah.
And so he's able to leave all of them behind because the place is about to blow. So I just kind of like that moment for himself.
Let me ask you, as someone who has binge read Superboy, were you kind of like, I'm sick of talking about the clone stuff? Was this like if you was this like he's already kind of been through this? You know what I mean?
I know what you mean. The Spider-Man clone saga got me into Spider-Man and hit me at a really early point in my journey. So I'm pretty much always game for clone talk.
You're like,
if
give
I'm
me
being
all
honest.
The clone stuff you got.
Was I okay that there was not much mention of tactile telekinesis? Yeah, I was okay with that. I was all right with that.
Oh, I did have a note on that. Is like, I liked how they did add a visual component to tactile. If you notice, it was highlighted yellow, I think.
Yeah.
It's like, so finally, maybe he doesn't have to say it every time. We can just see it, but.
Yeah, and like 20 years later, they're like, hey, you know what? Maybe just like a little visual cue.
Yeah.
To say it. So I guess let me ask you, we've been going for about an hour and I have a couple of kind of final questions to
Sure.
kind of tie this up that go beyond this series, but they're just kind of general big picture questions. But anything else about this Lemire series that we didn't talk about that you wanted to? Parasite
frogs.
Yes.
Parasite frogs are very cool. All right, go on.
Yes. No, I'm with you on that. So, it's this weird thing where this is our 5th and final episode in our All-Star Superboy event. And in terms of what we're covering, this ends in 2011, right? And we're recording this in 2025. And it's like, well, what about all the years to come? And And this is one of the really kind of heartbreaking aspects of all of this is that we talked about that first era of Superboy from 93 to 2003 to the start of the Teen Titans series. And then I feel like we move into our Connor Kent era from 2003 to 2011. And then he's off the board from 2011 through 2019 before he returned. So we have we sort of like our next phase of non-existence. I guess one quick question for you. So I have not read the New 52 Superboy series. I know it's not Connor. It's a different incarnation of the character. Right. And I'm not so close-minded to say, I'm never reading it. We're never talking about it. Give me enough episodes. Eventually I'll do something on it. And also, my view of New 52 Superman improved considerably once I finally opened myself up to it. So I'm at some point I might get there, but as of now, I don't have any plans to cover the New 52 Superboy. Have you read it? And is there any kind of value to be had there?
No.
Okay.
It's very forgettable mess, I think. Not horrible, just kind of there.
And am I correct? Is he a clone of Lois and Clark's son from the future or something like that?
Yes. He's like, boy, oh boy, it's very forgettable.
That's fine. Yeah, that's maybe.
Yeah, I think you have it because the thing that stands out was that his name is Kent Lane, which is weirdly like the only Superman son to have that last name. But I'm not going to try to give you the details.
That's fine. I guess the last thing I'll say on the New 52 front, what's odd to me though is that we talked briefly about the adaptations in other media of Connor Kent, and specifically you look at, well, all of them really, Smallville, the Young Justice Animated, and Titans. And in all three instances, they were able to tell the story wholly divorced from the death of Superman, right? It was just being cloned. And even in the New 52, they were still able to incorporate John Henry Irons. It wasn't that, he had to be there because Superman just died. So it's just odd to me, like we still could have had a version of Connor just like we had seen in those adaptations, yet they made this decision to bring in just a different version. So I mean,
and the thing too was that I don't think they said that it was not Connor for years. So I don't know when they overthought it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And then most recently in 2019, so now over these last 6 years, Connor is back in continuity and he's a member of the Super Family, and he made his return in the pages of the Bendis written Young Justice series. But long story short, we find out that he was trapped in Gem World. He had been investigating some funny business at Star Labs before the Flashpoint, and he got sucked into Gem World, this other dimension, and he was there when the universe was reset, and he was quote unquote flushed out of existence, and nobody remembered him, and it turns out he was having this whole other life on Gem World, and then he's ultimately found and rescued by the reformed Young Justice, and he makes his way back. At first, Superman doesn't remember him, but Ma and Pa do. And then we have, much more recently, there was the Man of Tomorrow miniseries where Superboy felt like he wasn't needed in a very crowded metropolis populated by the Super Family, and so he takes off for this outer space adventure. And then he comes back to find that actually he was missed, and the Super Family's there to greet him and give him a new jacket so that he's wearing essentially a uniform like the rest of the Super Family, only to make him that much harder to distinguish from John Kent. But well, that is what it is. Have you been following Connor's return over these past few years?
Yes, and like I say, I find a lot of it forgettable, and it is like okay, my era Superman's gone, or Superboy it's over. It's back to Jacket and that personality too.
Yes, yeah, no, I mean that's for sure.
I'm kind of like, you know what, I like Superman more. I know he was originally more like this. I'm just going to let the kids have Superboy. My honest take is trying to think how to say, I would not mind if there were no Superman family members.
This is something that has come up.
I'm not really begging for, oh, don't you know you could have just made him work if you just did what was in my head? You know what I mean? Like, I would be fine if he was just gone, to be frank. And it's not terrible to say, like, I wish he was just a moment in time and then his story finished. I don't think that's horrible, but this is long-term storytelling and people always have to come back, and it makes awkward situations for characters.
Yeah. So a couple of things. So I hear you. So, I mean, when I was first mapping out this event, I was planning to do a whole episode on the return of Connor. And as I started looking at the material a little bit more, and, you know, not to bag on Bendis, I've done that in other episodes, but you know, I did look at that more recent Young Justice series. I didn't read through the entire thing, but I read certain issues and I skimmed through basically the whole thing. And I hate to sound like such a old man, but it wasn't really my Young Justice. It didn't capture for me the spirit of that original series that means so much to me. I was reading it more from a mechanical point of view. It's like, all right, what happened to him? How did he come back?
Right.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. You know, he is back in the jacket. But personality wise, he really does feel like it doesn't feel like the Connor who's had all of these experiences that we've been talking about. And it's funny, as much as we talked about whether or not the Teen Titans, the start of the Teen Titans series tracked with what we had seen before, this feels like the harder reset where, I don't know, maybe there's an argument to be made. It's a little bit more of a blend of both versions of I don't know, but it just didn't really, to me, it felt more like an imitation. Like it just didn't really feel like my guy. So I do struggle with this. And you bring up this idea, and actually to kind of bring us home here, I have some questions. They all kind of get at the same idea from one of our patrons, Brian Dempsey. He says, with the cast of characters we have in the Superman books now, what role does Superboy play? Does the world need a Superboy? Do you think his best years are behind him? If he's going to continue to be present, what do you want to see them do with the character in the future? How does DC make him relevant in an overcrowded Superman family? And all valid questions, I think.
Yeah, I think the simple but will make people mad answer is yes, best years are behind him. I wouldn't mind if he was gone. I tend to say I like the members in their own corners, Hawaii being one of them, but I like Supergirl in space. But I would say, hey, put them in space, but they just did that. And
yeah, and the pages
wasn't that good.
Well, that, and then also, it's like literally as we're recording this, in recent issues of Green Lantern, he's popped up in space in the current Jeremy Adams series. So I don't know where that's going, but in addition to that Man of Tomorrow miniseries, like now he's also palling around with Green Lantern. So, I mean, we'll see where that goes. So I don't know. It seems like they're looking at space maybe as a potential venue for him. I don't know.
I really try not to be negative, but I'm very, my place right now is I think they're trying quantity over quality with a lot of things Superman. And that I think they bit off more than they can chew with the family.
I hear you. I guess where I am right now, and look, we'll see how this plays out in the years to come. I guess, yes, I'm not particularly loving the Connor stories that I've read over these past few years. It doesn't really feel like kind of this version that we've been talking about. I think the size and the location of the super family is a big issue. The fact that they're all primarily operating out of Metropolis. Yeah. And I do think, like to your point, I think spreading them out like they were back in the day would really help alleviate this. But I'll try to be positive as well. Kind of where I am on this is I'm glad that Connor is back. I mean, it really broke my heart when he was just gone for so long without any kind of farewell, because at least now there's potential. Right? There's potential for a take for someone to come along. I don't know, for Johns and Manapul to say, hey, we want to come back and do a sequel to our adventure comic stories.
But they would get eaten alive.
You think?
I don't think the youth would accept it. I think they want him. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. But all I'm saying is, like, I guess at least there's a chance that someone would come along with the take, with the location, with this something that, that might kind of light our fire. So, but yeah, I mean, it is kind of tough to just kind of see him in these crowded group scenes. And it's just kind of like, he's there. He's there.
And it's the same with Keenan Kong. It's the same with John. the twins are non-existent right now. They think that these huge shots of the family together are enough, or having them play video games together is enough, but nobody's getting a singular good character moment. Yeah.
Well, on a positive note, these stories that we read and discussed, to me, they held up great. And if anyone hasn't read them, and I wouldn't be surprised, especially that Lemire series, if people kind of slept on that one.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's worth taking a look, especially if you've been intrigued by our Superboy discussions. I would definitely encourage people to check them out. And it was a blast to compare notes and finally connect with you and have you on here. So I thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to say before we bid farewell?
Nope.
Right on. All right, man. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
And there you have it, folks. Our coverage of Connor Kent is complete. This had been on my list for a long time, and I'm really glad that we were able to give the kid his due. I really hope that you've enjoyed these episodes. I thank you very much for listening. I also want to give a very special shout out to all of the guests who joined me for these past episodes. And another thank you to artist Isaiah Simmons. A while back, Isaiah drew a fantastic piece of Connor sitting on a cloud, a la All-Star Superman. And of course, that gave rise to the title of this event, All-Star Superboy. And Isaiah very graciously allowed me to use that art as the basis for the promo that I created for this. So my thanks to Isaiah, and I encourage everyone to check out his art. Thank you all. Make sure you come back next week. I have a very special interview with the current Superman group editor, Paul Kaminsky. You don't want to miss it. Until then, as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. Support the podcast and receive exclusive content, including bonus episodes, by becoming a member at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. Flat Squirrel Podcasts is home to Digging for Kryptonite and another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman. Please subscribe, rate, and review today, and continue the conversation by joining us on social media. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all